One particular episode of the popular ITV video games programme Bad Influence features a segment highlighting the burgeoning and illicit practice of software piracy. The always chipper Andy Crane earnestly tells people that they shouldn't do it because it's against the law and could well blow up your system.
And be careful, if you use a fake cart, it might blow up your system.
Oh no.
But did this have an effect? Well, probably not. The segment highlighted the almighty X-Copy specifically, and in doing so essentially told people where you should look to find out how to pirate games, instead of warning them against doing it. There's also an episode of ITV police procedural The Bill from 1994, where a kid spends all his time cracking programs and selling them as part of a group called the Sunhill Cowboys, instead of being at home, and naturally, the evil pirate exploiting his talents gets his collar felt at the end. While there obviously aren't any statistics on hand, it is probable that copy meets where folks gathered together, blanks in hand, powered up their Amigas and traded all their games with each other, became even more popular thanks to such exposure.
At the moment, the manufacturers are one step ahead of the pirates because of these. CDs are relatively cheap to produce and at the moment almost impossible to copy.
But away from the sober tut-tutting of terrestrial television, there was a more direct and often more profane dialogue going on behind the scenes between the hacking groups who filled their bulletin boards with cracked games, your Fairlights, Paradoxes, Cortexes and the like, and the folks who coded the games themselves. It all happened right there on the game's discs, hidden in code that you would only see if you were a hacker, peering into the workings of the game out of sheer curiosity, or for the purposes of getting it out there for everyone to download. A lot of these messages make for entertaining reading, and thanks to resources such as the excellent cutting room floor, these missives from developers are now available for all to enjoy, and they paint quite the interesting picture of life behind the scenes, directly from the coder's chair if you will, that may not always be highlighted in more celebratory look-backs and reminiscence. It should be said that what's here in this video merely scratches the surface. They're just some of my favourites, examples of the various sorts of messages you would see. But there is so much more quality material out there. Everything from fierce barbs to friendly shout-outs, complaints about co-workers to utterly random nonsense. You should absolutely go to the cutting room floor at tcof.net to check out these messages and a whole lot more besides, while longtime cracker and WHD load wizard Code Tapper has compiled plenty more messages on a page for his Amiga and C64 website, with the help of the English Amiga board. They're all in one little place there, and I'll have links to all of this in the description. Anywho, let's get on with it, shall we? The most common type of message is naturally a plea, order, or even a threat from the coder to not pirate the game. As much as we may look back fondly on the bulletin board days with all of their groups, raves and cracktros and sine waves, a programmer in the early 90s who's depending on the royalties from a title's sales in order to get paid may not have felt the same way about it. For a starter, those looking deep into Chrysalis's 1990 puzzle platformer Mad Professor Moriarty would have found a message from the legendary musician Matt Furniss. Hello, hacker f***er. This is Matt Furniss. Here's the deal. If you hack this game, I will find you wherever you are and break your legs. And that's a promise. Grammatically wobbly, perhaps, but the feeling that Furniss most certainly did not want anyone cracking this game was very well conveyed. Similarly, an uncredited message found in the Bitmap Brothers' Xenon states the following: "Pirates are the filth of the f***ing world. 3 people have spent 7 months on this product, and scumbags rip it off in a couple of minutes. Yeah, very funny, ain't it?" A harsh message that's certainly designed to shame the crackers, but did it work? Well, judging by the amount of cracked versions of Xenon that are available for perusal on your average TOSEC set, the answer is most assuredly no. Some people took less of an aggressive approach towards the pirates in their messages, recognising that while cracks of the game were almost certain to come out, they hoped that the groups would have a little bit of honour and perhaps wait a little while before putting the commercial game out there. Visionary Design's Dragon's Lair features a message from programmer Randy Linden that hoped to appeal to the pirates' better judgment. A message to crackers: nobody wants copy protection. All it is designed to do is give a program a fighting chance. Now we realise that there is a great competition to see which group breaks this game first. However, if you do break it, please consider this. If you let this game out early after release and there are few sales, it will be very difficult to justify follow-up games of this type. Nobody benefits, not the developers, not the users, and not the Amiga community. Please reconsider holding on for a while and not letting the game suffer. The decision is yours. Did this calmer approach bear fruit? Well, actually, it appears so. A later message from the sequel, Dragon's Lair Escape from Singer's Castle, thanks the pirates for delaying the release of the original game while continuing to ask them to keep their honour and even hyping up a possible future project based on the Terminator, which alas never came out. It should also be noted that the code in question is the same Randy Linden who would go on to create the almighty Bleem commercial PS1 emulator, so there you go. There's also the case of poachers turned gamekeepers, people who used to be a part of the scene and are now releasing commercial games, hoping that they've generated enough cred in their time for the pirates to go easy on them. An example of this can be found in Danish ex-scenesters Melon Design's Naughty Ones from 1994, written by programmer Jacob Gorm Hansen and using his scene alias, Paleface. Sorry guys, no time for a proper protection. Have mercy. Melon Design did a lot for the scene, so please give us a break. No challenge in breaking this one anyways. P.S. We were never paid to make an intro for anyone, but maybe you will reward us by not cracking spreading this one, okay? P.P.S. I just spent my last money buying a mobile phone, so I really need every dime this game can make. Merry Christmas everyone, seeing you around. Paleface. Unfortunately, other groups like Paradox clearly disagreed when it came to cracking this title, and Kingdom's crack trophy for the game even features a somewhat blunt message of "fuck you" front and centre. While the target of Kingdom's wrath isn't identified, one does wonder if this is a response to Melon's plea to not crack the game because they'd done so much for the scene. A dismissal of the old group as traitors, someone with a more personal axe to grind, or something completely unrelated. It's hard to really say, but it is certainly fun to wonder. A common theme found in a lot of the anti-piracy messages is quite a predictable one. If you're so good at hacking into these games, why don't you try and create a game yourself? There's plenty of examples of this. The classic Blood Money by DMA Design features this one from Dave Jones. Well, hello there, hackers. I'll warn you now that this game has a lot of protection, so it will be a few late nights for you lot. It's a mugs game anyway. You should be writing games and making loads of money like me. You too could afford a 16V Astra GTE. But you are obviously lacking in a few brain cells and will put a week's work into cracking this for what? Sod all, that's what. Well, if you do manage to crack it, send me a copy. Dave Jones, DMA Design, Mintlaw Park, West Ferry, Dundee, DD5 1RD. In return, you will get sod all, as usual. In the meantime, I'll be thinking of you when I'm in Florida, spending some of my dosh. An even more cutting example can be found in Suspicious Cargo, a 1991 game from Gremlin. This one here is written by a man called Dave the Exile, who I believe would be Dave Lincoln of Exile Designs. Mr. E says hi to all the sad crackers, that means you, who can't crack this 100%. Have fun with the checksums, lamers. I'll be looking out for a copy I can finish, so sad bastards, Merry Christmas. Till then, war. Dave Exile says, the game may run, but does it play till the end? You dicks probably can't finish it to find out anyhow. Those who can, write games. Those who can't, just crack games. I feel sorry for you sad people. Maybe one day you'll get a life. Oh, but you would need a personality for that. And you might have to come out of your bedroom. Till then, you'll have to get your kicks from cracking games and reading wank mags. Over and out, Dave the Exile. Mind you, some companies were a little bit more canny and saw these messages as a means of advertisement. If you're good enough to get into this game, maybe you're good enough to come and work for us. There's no end of messages that feature a phone number and an invitation to get in touch if you know your way around the Amiga's blitter, such as this one here composed by Titus Software's Eric Kane for Fire and Forget. Amiga's blitter is very fast if you use it directly. If you know how to use the disk hardware direct, call me, eKane from Titus 331 4332 1092. Thank you. On a similar theme, you do have messages where the coders may not necessarily be fully disapproving of the practice of cracking, but they're certainly going to try and stop it, or at least delay it, through a hefty copy protection system full of sneaky checksums and the like. The coder might then wonder if you, hacker, a pathetic creature of meat and bone, are up to the challenge. Can you push through and release a good crack of this game? Here's a quite extreme message like this courtesy of Morbid Visions, makers of Psygnosis's 1993 game Perihelion. Yo buddy, I don't know and I don't care how and why are you here, I just want to give you a few advisors in case if you're here to crack this stuff. Well, in every 80 seconds a man is murdered, and in every 10 seconds another one of our protection stages starts. In other words, you can be sure that you will never have a working crack of Perihelion. Wanna bet? Of course you're proud and you'll try, I too would try, but you will fail because you won't even realise where did you fail, what's the problem, what is protection and what is not. That's life. Will you play it over a dozen times? It won't work. Will you release a f***ing dying half crack? What a shame. Relax, honey, you're gonna suck up, not because you're so lame, but because we are so good. Right? Well, that's all for today. Now go back to your childish toys and let's see how our computerized insecticide works on parasites like you. By the way, did you know that piracy is theft? Oh, surely not, sorry. Now at least you cannot say we didn't warn you. Signed, Morbid Visions. It should be noted that, as alluded to in this message, indeed, not all cracks are created equal. If you're using a TOSEC set of ADFs that feature all sorts of cracked versions of games, you'll certainly run into some bad ones where you may be able to start the game and play it for a bit, but it could be unstable and crash a lot, or indeed just completely fail after a certain point, perhaps in spectacular fashion, like this cracked version of Cannon Fodder 2 did for me on a stream, just after finishing Mission 4. Wow, it's like my Amiga Emu just up and ate itself. Left. Could be dangerous, you go first. Of course, not every developer message is aimed squarely at the scenesters and pirates, telling them in salty language to not copy the game, making promises related to a budding hacker's legs and the breaking of them, or hyping up the trouble the swashbucklers are going to have figuring out the game's protection system. There's a lot of happy little shout-outs to fellow employees, as well as the occasional airing of a coder's frustrations, such as Jeremy Sherlock's text in Splinter Vision's Eco Phantoms, bemoaning the efforts of someone who walked out on the project. Written by Toby Simpson and Jeremy Sherlock, it must be said that Richard Costas was the original programmer along with Toby on this project, but because Ricky walked out and I took over from him, rewriting a lot of his shit and badly written, unprofessional and ridiculously long-winded code, and the fact that this was only half finished, I have decided not to include this fat git in the credits for this game. Signed, Jez. I will credit Richard Costas with the blame for a lot of hassle, stress, late nights, and my hatred for the twat. So, who even was Richard Costas? He doesn't seem to exist beyond this furious message, and we have no idea at all if this savagery was warranted, but it goes to show that the hidden texts were certainly a good way for coders to release their anger at a co-worker, or indeed a boss and the system that they're working on. How about this one from 1988 Streetgan, translated from the original German? The entire chip RAM is needed. F***ing Amiga. I'm selling an Amiga 2000 Board B with 2 disk drives and hard disk. See you again at the Archimedes. Why do you think I'm selling that piece of crap Amiga? Fuck Mark Ulrich. Mark Ulrich being the founder and boss of Rainbow Arts, and Mr. C here being Frederick Haugen, who was previously a musician in the demo scene before making this game for Time Warp Productions, a dev studio that was very much associated with Rainbow Arts. In any case, looks like the Amiga didn't make it possible for him. Some of the messages are even quite friendly when it comes to the pirates. Paul Carter, the programmer for Millennium's Mr. Blobby, simply put a little message in saying that he'd left some sectors free just for the Crackers intros. And if you want something that's a bit more heartwarming, well, look no further than the message that Simon Phipps left for Cause, Saint and Grievesy. This game is dedicated with love to Jane, the lady I marry tomorrow. Simon Phipps, 2nd of June 1989. You must be hacking to find this. All the best to you for the future. P.S. This game was started 15th of February 89, this is the last, hopefully, time I change it, 30th of August 89. And married life is great. In a word, DAW. But in the world of hidden developer messages, on the Amiga, there is one person who stands high and mighty over everyone else. A genius who could combine everything mentioned in this article into one long-winded, verbose, and usually quite funny bit of reading. And that man was Richard Applin. Applin, the man who was often responsible for completing ports of games such as Final Fight and Double Dragon with little time and almost no help from the original creators, was a master of the hidden message. Final Fight, a sequel of sorts to one of his other thoroughly eloquent roasts of the Crackers on Line of Fire, is quite possibly his magnum opus. It features the usual dismissal of Crackers and their exploits, but it goes to a whole other level, mocking them with a fill-in-the-blanks crack-tro that deserves to be experienced in full. Cracked, trained, knobbed up and half-parted by the amazing blank. Call our UK HQ on blank for 1.4 terabytes of wares stored on Sinclair Microdrive, online 25 hours a minute, 75 19.2 gigabaud. Hot greets to Taz, Faz, Gaz, Baz, Haz, Kaz, Waz and Saz. Limp arm wavings to humongous big penis substitute of the utterly inanely named crew. Look mum, I can use Seeker, Tetra Pak and DMS. Next week I'm learning bowel control. I've got a mate who can do fantastically dull pseudo house music on Noise Tracker, and another mate is really amazing at doing uninteresting bas-relief metallic logos on D-Paint. We're going to call ourselves Wet Dream Design and do a game for Psygnosis, and they'll pay us £7.5 million and we'll get our photos ridiculed in Zero, and then we're going to do Super Famicom games and charge more than the national debt of Brazil. And after that, it's virtual reality. And I actually saw Andrew Braybrook at the PC show, and he actually spoke to me, and we had this really good conversation, and I told him all about how crap Rainbow Islands is, and how he should have written it using Seeker, and used hardware sprites for the scrolling background, and when I asked him why he left out the bit on the arcade machine when you first turn it on, and some glitched graphics come up for a 30th of the second, which really contributes to the gameplay, he said, "Why don't you shut the fuck up and leave me alone, you irritating little twat?" And I knew he was just saying that, because he knew I was right, and how much better than him I am. And I bet he's never written a Parallax Sprite Starfield signed Scrolly Bob demo with soundtracker music in his life. And I bet he wouldn't even know how, and he's rubbish anyway, you know. I actually saw one BNE in his code that could have been a BNE.S, and I nearly wet myself. I mean, how can he call himself a programmer when he obviously isn't nearly as good as me, etc, 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 etc. Anyway, I must go now, as my mum says my rusks are getting soggy. See you later, Gwingis dudes. Intro by Huge Red Pork Sword of the Total Annihilation and Death to Everyone crew. P.S. When I grow up, I want to be a British railguard. Apologies to BO employees everywhere. Totally naff intro with some filled polygon graphics that rotate around their own axes because I don't have a clue how the code works as I got it off my mate in Sweden. Pointless and really badly bugged trainer options with oh my god, not another parallax starfield, and signed scrolly message, if I ever see another one, I'm going to leave the country and become a Trappist monk in Tibet. Mind you, that wouldn't be a very good idea now the Chinese have invaded. Ah well, maybe just suicide or even demo right-suicide is the answer. Pitifully badly cracked version of the game that only runs with an A501 Insider RAM board on my computer, and anyway the file loader I got out of Amiga disk drives inside and out has the headstep delay set much too fast so it crashes all the time, and even then it uses a software timing loop so it won't work on faster processors. Sometimes I really don't know why you lot bother, I really don't. Oh shit, it's Guru'd. Ah well, what do you expect? Your Amiga has the one colour Fat Agnes chip, and the power light is too bright, and the drive makes the one pitched clicking noise. It works alright on my TV, honest. Right, that, to quote my line of fire startup sequence, is that over with. Aplin's messages, which can be found in a few of the games he worked on, range from cute little one-liners to full breakdowns of a port's development, with so many different details. Everything from teardowns of the original arcade board to full-on developer diaries, as well as a long list of all the music that helped Applin through a port's creation. While not an Amiga game, his message on the Amstrad CPC version of Shinobi in particular is well worth seeking out and reading on TCOF. It's a diary of sorts, a look at the rigmaroles of late 80s and early 90s game development from right in the very thick of it. Something really that's rarer even than a hen's golden tooth. Some wags may well say that these messages are a fair bit better than the ports that they came from. And well, they would be right. It's pretty obvious to say that these messages had little to no effect on the scene and how quickly it generated cracked versions of games. At best, they may have made a newbie feel bad for half a second or so before they went ahead and clicked the big old execute button that only exists in 90s computer-based TV thrillers and dramas. It's perhaps a reminder that legends of the business such as the Bitmaps, or Dave Jones, or Barry Leach, he of the "You Will Not Copy This Game" sample embedded deep into Lotus 2's title screen music,
"You will not copy this game,"
may not be as nostalgic or as positive about the Amiga's scene culture as a lot of us are, even all these years later. On a personal level, the release of a game into the scene may well have left an already hard-up coder with less money than they'd hoped to receive from a title. They do, however, provide a bit of a time warp back to these days and into the world of programming games as the developers lived it. Whether they're vicious screeds, shoutouts to mates, or even song lyrics, we can be very thankful that the people who wrote them didn't highlight all of this text and hit the delete key just before the game went gold, so that we can now enjoy them ourselves and get a look into the programmers' occasionally inscrutable minds. Bye for now. It's time for football. In particular, it's time for a very nostalgic and very special footy game. It's on the Amiga, it goes like the clappers, it's got tiny little sprites, but it's not sensible soccer. It's Football Glory. Funnily enough, Football Glory was actually one of the very first games covered on this channel, way back in 2012, the Mega Wii Views days. So seeing as how that video's almost old enough to start developing acne and falling out with its parents, I thought it was about time to have a proper look at this game, and the story behind it. On the one hand, Football Glory is a game that looks, on the surface, to be a rather shameless rip-off. On the other hand, playing it actually reveals a lot of differences and additions to the classic Sensi formula that makes playing the game a pretty fresh experience. And then, on the other hand, it's the first game by a studio from a country with basically no commercial gaming history, and said studio would go on to much bigger and greater things. There's a lot to uncover then with this simple game. So let's kick it back to 1994 and give this classic a go. The best way to get going here is with the company that published Football Glory, a bunch of guys called Black Legend, one of the few Amiga companies with a logo that could out-prog rock Psygnosis. Formed in Switzerland in 1992 before joining up with UK distributors Compart and moving to St Albans in 1993 followed by Welwyn Garden City, Black Legend were, in the grand scheme of things, a late arrival to the Amiga scene. Now sure, if you were simply a customer back in 1992, you may have thought that everything on the Amiga was just great. Look, There's new computers hitting the shelves, there's plenty of games coming out, we've got bundles out the arse, Amiga magazines are absolutely jam-packed. On the inside, however, 1992 is where, gradually, more and more companies are seeing the writing on the wall. PCs are making massive inroads, and Commodore isn't providing any competition for that. If that doesn't change, and obviously it won't, then Finn's long term look pretty bleak. But it's here where Black Legend come in, and they do so with a pretty new angle. Compart had a lot of outposts dotted around Europe, and the aim of the partnership with Black Legend was to work with smaller European studios, a lot of whom came from former Soviet bloc countries as well as Scandinavia, where there was a nascent and untapped scene for computers like the Amiga, with flourishing demo scenes and a hell of a lot of potential. Rather than being moved over to the UK, these coders would still be working in their home countries, and there was a bit more of a laid-back approach when it came to things such as deadlines and what have you. A fair number of the coders who worked with Compart and Black Legend were part-timers. Black Legend's first games do indeed show a lot of potential. Other than Football Glory, the main game I knew them for back in the day is a Euro platformer called Fat Man the Caped Consumer, a rather silly title produced by a Hungarian studio named IO Product. The game here in the main is a fairly standard collect 'em up, but the premise is enjoyably comedic, the music is cracking, and the gameplay's okay enough. Not the best, but I have a real soft spot for it. Other less inspiring releases include Moscow Nights, an MS-DOS compilation of what is, by and large, a bunch of Russian games that aren't anywhere near the level of Tetris, although the compilation does include Drop Drop, which is the original version of a game that would be licensed by Data East and, in their hands, become the all-time classic puzzler Magical Drop. Other earlier titles by them include Hyperion, a 3D shooter from Norwegian developers Offense Studios. While this is pretty much a Zarch clone, it's not exactly a bad one, especially if you're not utterly awful at Zarch or games like it, like I am. A bit more original is Statics, from German studio Seventh Sign. This is another match-3 type game, although you also have to use the blocks to balance out a seesaw, which does add a nice dimension when it comes to actually constructing the well. Simple, but chilled out and with some excellent music as well. There's also Crystal Dragon, a fine-looking and typically tough dungeon-crawling RPG by the excellent Magnetic Fields. There's a compilation of simpler games from Hungary, and the odd title that never ended up coming out. Flower, for the Love of the World Enchanted Road, was a Rodland-esque cutesy platformer that didn't quite make it, although a demo of it does exist. And the shoot-em-up Shenandoah Daughter of the Stars was absolutely raved about in mags and the like by anyone who'd seen it before it entered development hell. Happily, this game did finally arrive on PC in 2016 under the title 1993 Space Machine, with a PS4 release under the Shenandoah name happening in 2023. There's a good few intriguing Black Legend titles out there, and it didn't take long for them to start getting a fair bit of attention. They were quick to establish relationships with the Amiga press and get their opinions out there, and they were also pretty keen to provide the mags with Coverdisk material. Soon enough they were in most magazines' good books. Still, despite the rather unique angle they had, the post-Soviet studios and all of that, they would inevitably have most of their success with football. After all, football is kin on the Amiga. Thanks to Kickoff, and particularly thanks to Sensible Soccer, football basically ends up being the main thing most people want on the computer. Not just regular old football, but football management as well. Back in the Worst Amiga Power Games vid, we saw Steve McGill bemoan that even the absolute laziest and worst games out there were bound to shift at least a few units simply because they had football or soccer in the title. Black Legend's first tilt at this big market came in the shape of the UK-developed Tactical Manager 1 and 2. While these aren't exactly the best-looking football management games out there, they did do quite well due to featuring a pretty strong multiplayer component, with space for over 40 human-controlled managers taking turns in the hot seat. And as for the second, more action-packed football game, well, that's the one we're covering, and it's going to introduce us to about half a dozen demo scene lads from Croatia who've decided to form their own little studio. Croteam was officially formed by a quartet of people in August 1992, all of whom were located in the Utrina suburb of Zagreb in Croatia. Roman Ribovic, Davor Honski, Dean Sekulic and Damir Perovic, a group of friends who'd all gone to the same high school and were involved in coding, making various non-commercial games for platforms like the Spectrum and then the Amiga, pretty much just for the fun of it. When Black Legend put the word out around Eastern Europe that they were looking for developers, they quickly ended up getting in touch and the Croteam team was soon doubled. Alan Ladovac, Tomislav Pongrac, Admir Elizovic and Marko Sekulic all joined the Croteam project from the country's demo scene. Officially, Croatia was obviously a pretty new country at the time. They declared independence from Yugoslavia in 1991, a move which soon led to a war that would last for 4 years, ending in August of 95. Naturally, at this stage, Croatia didn't have any history at all when it came to commercial games publishing. And as we'll see, the people at Croteam took it upon themselves not just to become the first Croatian studio to release a game in Europe, but to help other groups do the same, bringing them under the Black Legend win. For now though, the subject of their first big computer game had a pretty easy inspiration. Football was, and indeed still remains, a big passion for Croteam, something that they loved to watch and also loved to play. To this day you're still likely to find Croteam folks on the pitch as you are anywhere else, especially if there's some sort of games industry tournament happening. What to say then about this first game, this football title? Well, Football Glory eventually hit the shelves in November of 1994, but not before a big flurry of press announcing not just this title, but other games that were going to come out under the Croteam banner. A combat flight sim called Embryo, a top-down shooter called Spherical Worlds, and a first-person dungeon crawler named Evil's Doom, the latter of which would unfortunately never end up getting released. Football Glory was the first game up to the plate, and the game's previews quickly went to the topic of its similarity to Sensi, especially in the one where Black Legend boss Richard Holmes was certainly questioned over it. Holmes's defence was that the guys at Croteam hadn't played Sensible Soccer. He said that they looked similar mainly because the game was using 16 by 16 pixel sprites as opposed to 32 by 32, and that no one had copyright on the size of a little man. If they had, then Sensible Software would have been sued by the makers of Lemmings. Other than this, the preview's full of lots of claims of just what people are going to see in Football Glory. A whole load of movements and techniques that were inspired by watching Brazil in action at the World Cup, realistic calculations when it comes to how the ball reacts when it does things like hit the post, not to mention rather outlandish situations such as pitch invasions happening and what have you. It all sounds quite wild, to be honest, but over the course of Football Glory and its later sequel, the majority of what Holmes says in the preview would end up appearing. Even if Football Glory may have looked similar to another, much more famous title, it ended up doing a lot of things differently, and it did a lot of things damn well. So once you get into the game and decide which of the usual flavours of football you want, whether you want a regular old friendly, 1 or 2 players, clubs or nations, a tournament or a league or whatever, the question is, does the game actually play like Sensible Soccer? And the answer is that no, it really doesn't. Football Glory plays an even faster and a much more chaotic game of football. Hell, it's so chaotic that it's actually quite on brand with Croteam's later releases. The passing is like a bullet, the ball can go from one end to the other in all of a few seconds, and that's just before you get to all the things that the game adds in. If you were to play this back to back with the much more measured Sensible Soccer, you wouldn't find a lot of similarities beyond the looks, and it's not as if Sensi's a slouch. Running can also be quite key in Football Glory. You do at times get a big old boost of speed that allows you to blitz past the defences in no time flat, and while you don't necessarily need that in order to make your way past the backlines, which in all honesty are a fair bit stupider than they are in Sensi, it is certainly effective and can even allow you to run past the keeper. Pretty much everything here is focused on attack. You can put an absolute ton of aftertouch on the ball, which while it may not be the most natural implementation, seeing as you can do it basically whenever you want, is pretty handy when it comes to fooling the keeper and sending him the wrong way. And then there's all the extra techniques. Diving headers are here of course, but there's also bicycle kicks, volleys, jump in a tackle, rapid 1-2 passing. There's a lot to be getting on with. In practice, all of this means that Football Glory is all about goals. Lots of goals. As already mentioned, the CPU's defense isn't exactly the brightest around, so once you get handy with the controls, you'll be hitting the back of the onion bag a ton. However, the CPU is pretty effective in attack as well, and more than capable of pulling off all the banana shots and overhead kicks that you can, so you'll likely be letting a good few goals in yourself. It isn't uncommon for a 5 minutes per half match to feature around 15 to, hell, even 20 goals. Even if things go drastically wrong and you end up 6 goals behind or whatever, you still may have a half decent chance of pulling the whole game back if you're able to improve your attacking play. Now, are these rugby-esque scorelines in any way realistic? Well, obviously not, but it sure is fun. If there's one area where Football Glory does absolutely lord it over Sensi, it is here in the attacking play. I find that with this game there's a lot more ways to score, even without using the bicycle kicks or whatever. You can be very creative with your shots, it feels quite satisfying when you properly fool the keeper, and it's especially satisfying when you crash a shot in off the post. Again, the ball reacts off the post much more wildly and variedly to how it does in Sensi, where it usually just comes straight off at a 90-degree angle. And you always get a zoomed-in, slow-motion, picture-in-picture replay of your goal, complete with a shout of, "Magnificent goal!" if you've scored a right belter. At least that's what you get if you're playing the game on an A1200. Playing against the computer in Football Glory, for the most part, is never not highly entertaining, with matches full of ups and downs and near enough constant action. And obviously it's even better when you're playing with a friend.
Magnificent goal!
With all of this does come a whole batch of weirdness, not all of which necessarily may be to everybody's taste, but I did mention that this game is a chaotic one that, in retrospect, is exactly the sort of football game you would expect Croteam to make, even if it is their first game. Beyond the little men and the similarities to Sensi that brings, there's quite a lot of flair in the graphics, and especially a lot of flair in the animation. I always like how the pitch gradually gets more and more pockmarked with dirt slides from tackles as the match goes on, and the game fits in a ton of extra animation for all of its moves, as well as the dribbling, all the celebrations and that. And yes, some of this animation isn't necessarily in service of the game. You do get a fair bit of comedy in Football Glory. There's always a ref on the pitch, and he usually has something to say about bad tackles. If he sends someone off, there'll be a spot of dialogue, and at times the offending player may well have a chance to vainly chase after the ref for a few seconds. Injuries will bring about either a doctor complete with magic spray, or a couple of orderlies to stretcher the poor sod off if it's particularly bad, as well as more dialogue, and then there's the thoroughly random, completely out there occurrences. You may well get a pitch invasion courtesy of a streaker, a protester, or a canine. Some people did complain a bit about these things happening, and that it was just a completely pointless stoppage of the game, although honestly these pitch invasions are very rare. In all the time that I've played Football Glory, I've only seen them occur a couple of times. Perhaps the most chaotic thing of all is that sometimes the computer will just flat out give you a goal. The keeper will make an absolutely ludicrous mistake and end up twatting the ball into his own net, at which point there'll be more amusing text to mark the occasion. This is just the sort of thing that happens with this game. It is certainly quite crude in this regard, although often these stupid goals don't make an awful lot of difference to a match's outcome because the scorelines end up being so high. Now, I must say that I absolutely love Football Glory. On the whole, is it better than Sensi? Well, no, perhaps not. It's certainly incredible as an offensive package, but Sensible Soccer is the more balanced title and quite clearly the more influential game. Is it the best slice of football action that you can get on the Amiga outside of Sensible Soccer? Well, the answer to that for me is yes. There are a lot of other really good footy games on the Amiga, some of which are more inspired by Sensi than others, the likes of Empire Soccer 94 and Sierra Soccer that will give you 90 rock-solid virtual minutes, but for me, Football Glory is the definite number 2. Some of that may have to do with nostalgia and actually owning the title back in the day, but this game still holds up superbly whenever I boot it up now. It's one of the best footy games for a quick match because it's a dead cert that lots of stuff is bound to happen, and it does come with a whole load of very pretty graphics and animation. I love this game dearly, and it certainly makes for a fine alternative to Sensi. Croteam absolutely nailed it. It's not totally flawless. The referee can be an annoyingly harsh git, and it can be very easy to accidentally sizzle the living hell out of an opposing player, and in particular the goalkeeper, which results in an automatic red card. And I am sure for some people this game may just be too chaotic a representation of football, especially with all the moments where it's trying to be funny. But a lot of the time, this is exactly the sort of eventful, if not necessarily realistic, footy experience that I'm looking for. It is stonking arcade stuff. The reviews for Football Glory were a little bit of a mixed bag, ranging from the outrageously effusive to the much more critical. It is perhaps no surprise that CU Amiga and Amiga Action gave it the best reviews, with CU Amiga in particular giving it the quite frankly ridiculous mark of 95%, for a review that was naturally both an exclusive and then proudly displayed on the game's box. Now, as much as I love Football Glory, I do think that this is a pretty extreme score. I would say that this is the definition of a damn fine mid-high 80s game, one that's certainly recommended, but not a 95% score that you would reserve for an all-time great. Now, as mentioned before, Black Legend did foster a pretty good relationship with the magazines, and you do wonder if a part of that resulted in this staggering score, as well as the 90% it got from Amiga Action. Not that it matters so much, seeing as the game is pretty damn good. Amiga format were very positive with an 80%, the One were iffier with 74, and Amiga Power were quite harsh with a 66. It is worth keeping in mind that Football Glory did have the toughest competition possible. It was released at virtually the same time as Sensible World of Soccer, just about the most hotly anticipated game on the platform, and a sequel that most mags would end up treating as the best title the Amiga had ever seen. However, even with this competition, Football Glory was still able to sell strongly, placing very high in the monthly charts. Indeed, it sold more than enough for Sensible Software to clearly think that the game was a serious threat, and that Football Glory was very blatantly making a big yellow mark on its territory. John Hare and company were vocally highly unhappy about Football Glory, deeming the game to be a clone that was trying to profit off of what Sensi had created. Much like the more critical reviewers of the game, the likes of The One's Simon Byron and AP's Paul Mellerick, they clearly weren't convinced about Richard Holmes's claims that Croteam had never played Sensible Soccer before, and in the end Sensi and Renegade were able to, at least temporarily, get Football Glory pulled from shelves with the threat of legal action. Judging by the charts, this likely happened around about the summer of '95. While this was indeed only for a short time, it was enough for Football Glory sales to take a bit of a knock. That said, the knock wasn't necessarily as big as some claimed. It, as well as Black Legend's other footy-based title, Tactical Manager, were the company's best ever selling products, which, judging by estimates in David Quix's feature on the company in the 196th issue of Retro Gamer, meant that Football Glory was good for sales probably in the 80 to 100,000 range over both its Amiga and PC-DOS releases. Later on in 1995, with Sensi's claims presumably unable to stand up to legal scrutiny, the game did get a re-release through Ocean on the Hit Squad label, and it was eventually released as freeware by Croteam in 1998. Anyway, we're not finished yet. We do still have a sequel to look at, as well as seeing just what else Black Legend and Croteam got up to. By this time, Black Legend also had an outpost in Germany, as well as a burgeoning partnership with Croteam that would, despite being so late on in the Amiga's commercial years, result in a good few games from other Croatian studios. Previously we mentioned Embryo and Spherical Worlds, and while these games weren't directly released by Croteam, they were made by other Croatian studios. Embryo was made by a group called Beyond Arts, Spherical Worlds was made by Formatted, and they came out in 1994 and 1996 respectively. Black Legend were also still very much looking for other studios from former Soviet bloc countries. Two other games that they published would be a duo of titles that are known to those who tried ever so valiantly to get a taste of that PC Doom magic on their humble Amiga. Those games are Behind the Iron Gate and Citadel, both of which hailed from Poland and were released in 1995. Ego's Behind the Iron Gate is... yeah... One of the weakest attempts. It's such a bare title that you'll probably end up getting lost in seconds, and the control system is absolutely maddening. Conversely, Virtual Design's Citadel is one of the better ones. It's not without faults, but it plays a hell of a lot better. You would need a beast of an Amiga for the game to be playable at any size larger than a postage stamp, mind you. That said, it's something for this game to actually be capable of running at all on something like an A500, even if it is tiny there. Also, this is a game where running into the walls hurts you, so watch out for that. Unfortunately, Black Legend couldn't do a whole lot about time and motion. As we hit 1996, things are very clearly coming to an end on the Amiga. In Retro Gamer, Richard Holmes observed that with every gaming expo, less and less companies were joining them in peddling Amiga wares, and they weren't exactly kitted out for the move to 3D, the PlayStation and what have you. And so the decision was made to close Black Legend, although their German outpost did last a few months longer before shutting up shop, and it's here where we get Croteam's sequel to Football Glory. Back in the one's preview of the original, Holmes said that the game would feature an indoor mode. That didn't happen, but only because said indoor mode would eventually become a whole other game called Five-A-Side Soccer that was initially released in Germany only and eventually made free in 2000. This game is surely right up my street. You've got all the chaos of Football Glory, but now it's indoors, complete with all manner of walls to bounce balls off? Yeah, clearly this game is a no-brainer. Now sure, it's little more than Football Glory with walls, a bunch more extra animations, and some of the sillier ones taken out. No chasing the ref this time, I'm afraid. But, well, it's Football Glory but with walls. Rather than different seasons, you can pick different courts to play the match on that will affect the ball's bounce and so on. Parquet, clay, grass, astroturf and what have you. And the game certainly takes things seriously, with different wall sets available and the like. While there had been indoor football modes in games before, this is definitely a bit more in-depth, and there's certainly a marked difference in the quality of some of the teams as well, more so than there is in Football Glory, I reckon. While I would still pick the original game over this one, Five-A-Side Soccer is a very nice take on the formula, and there's not a whole lot else like it on the Amiga. As someone who generally loves indoor football modes, it's right up my alley. After this, as far as people outside of Croatia went, Croteam went quiet. If you didn't know any better, you may have thought for a while that they were lost to time, one of many Amiga developers that came about in the computer's later days, released a couple of games, and then disappeared. If you were in Croatia, however, you may well have seen their work on television. They spent some time developing a game called Save the Earth, a game in the Hugo Joe Raz vein that is actually, technically, their first 3D title. There is unfortunately no way to play this game, although there is footage available of it on YouTube, taken from the kids' TV show Turbo Limac, or Limac or whatever. And aside from that, well, Croteam weren't gone at all. They were in the woodshed, and in 2001 they would show the fruits of their labours to the whole world. Now, Serious Sam is obviously a classic, an utterly brilliant and thoroughly arcade-minded first-person shooter, something that was even considered something of a throwback in 2001, chock full of personality and bristling with action. It is a pretty damn important game too, not just because it paved the way for so many other first-person titles in this vein with its arenas filled with crowds of enemies and all that, you know, the ones that get classified under the dreaded term boomer shooter nowadays. It's important because it and the Serious Engine also flew the flag for independent 3D games development in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe. It showed that if you had the skill and the creativity without necessarily having the money, you could build an engine for this sort of game yourself, as opposed to shelling out millions of dollars for a licensed one. And the early 2000s saw plenty other developers pop up around Europe with the same ideas, ready to break their own new grounds. PC Mag cites the likes of Crytek and CD Projekt Red as being amongst this lot, and Croteam were one of the first European indies to put out a brilliant 3D game like this, show that it was possible to give the major studios a bloody nose whilst on a budget, and rightly earn a whole load of success. It really paved the way. Without their early work, all of this likely doesn't happen. Not just Football Glory, but the partnership with Black Legend that pretty much single-handedly created the games industry in Croatia. They've certainly never forgotten the title. It's been available as freeware for a long time, there's a Football Glory themed Easter egg in the 4th Serious Sam game, and the studio have even proclaimed that their most recent title, the Talos Principle 2, is actually a spiritual successor to Football Glory. Now okay, that last one might possibly be a little tongue-in-cheek, but clearly it is still a title that they're fond of, and while it might be unlikely that we ever see a Football Glory HD, Football Glory 4K or anything like that, it's hard to fully discount that because Croteam are, after all, one of those studios that tend to surprise you with the directions that they go in. It is hard to say much bad about them, and it all started with an Amiga footy game that, even if it may well have been considered quite similar to a much bigger title, still had plenty to offer. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now. Many greetings of the season to you all. At this time of the rolling year, it's common to have a look at some Christmas games. Even if they've all pretty much been done by this stage, there's a certain familiarity about it, isn't there? Christmas is often about tradition, after all. I'm sure that in the years to come, watching videos about Christmas Nights or the official Father Christmas game or whatever will be as set into the rituals of the holidays as watching a Bond film, pretending to enjoy Christmas pudding and hiding all the good booze from your annoying relatives. This little compilation vid will certainly contain a few old festive gaming favourites, but how's about mixing it up just a tad? The Amiga has a good few examples of Christmas-themed games, particularly the ones that would appear on magazine cover discs around December. You've actually got some quite famous titles kicking about here, and we'll certainly be seeing the likes of Christmas Lemmings in this vid. But there's some other little things worth looking at when it comes to the magazine's general festive offering. Some special demos, some nice PD titles, other exclusives that may not exactly be Christmassy but were released at the time, and even the odd full game that's the equivalent of receiving an appointment for a prostate examination in your stocking. So what we have here is a little overview of some of the best, the most intriguing, and the flat-out worst things that you could snag from the covers of Amiga magazines at this time of the year, with selections from Amiga Power, Amiga Format, The One, Amiga Action, and CU Amiga. Let's have a look. The most common type of Christmas-themed game on the cover discs is, of course, the Christmas demo. It's a game that's already out, but it's a demo that's wholly original and festive-themed. And obviously this game here's the most famous example. Hell, Christmas Lemmings was such a good idea that DMA Design would make it a proper expansion pack, releasing several holidays-themed Lemmings expansions in the early 90s. But this is the original one, appearing on an Amiga format cover disc in January 1992, almost a year after the first game had been demoed in the mag. This 4-level festive treat also helps to promote Oh No More Lemmings, the original expansion pack which had just made its way onto the shop shelves. The levels themselves are pitched just about right, not the hardest levels or anything, but certainly not the easiest possible either, and you'd probably have to wrestle a little bit with them if this was the first time you'd actually played Lemmings. Mind you, it'll probably still be fun enough because it's frickin' Lemmings and it's one of the best Amiga games ever made, arguably one of the computer's very best contributions to gaming as a whole. That 4th level with all the constant pausing is quite fiendish, mind you. I'm not sure if that'd be in the fun category in a regular Lemmings game. On the whole, it's a fine extra for the many fans of the little green-haired dafties, and it'd kick off a yearly tradition that eventually would kind of come full circle. One of the Holiday Lemmings expansion packs that Psygnosis would release every year ended up being demoed in The One for Christmas 1994. It's still traditional Lemmings, not Lemmings 2 and certainly not All New World, and people still loved it. This one here's another cool demo. The levels are a bit easier here than the original Christmas Lemmings, but it's hard not to have fun with this game really. That and this was one of the first cover discs I ever owned, so it's definitely got a lot of nostalgia associated with it. Not everyone perhaps put in the same festive effort as DMA and Psygnosis did. Sometimes you'd have demos that shout "Christmas" from the cover, and then fiendishly they're not bloody Christmassy in the slightest. Codemasters are guilty of this. They put something called Christmas Dizzy on Amiga Power in 1994, which sounds cool. It wouldn't be the first time that Cody's made something original for the Macs after all. But alas, it's just a screen from Fantastic Dizzy where you can sod about a bit and play the sliding puzzle game. Amiga Power didn't really let them get away with it, calling it a totally non-Christmas related mini Dizzy game. The very same issue features a similar demo for Seek and Destroy that might make you expect some more festive top-down chopper action, but again, nothing doing. It's just a regular demo, and anyone who wanted to put snowmen to the sword with hellfires or whatever would have been bitterly disappointed. A bit better, although still not too festive, is Rick Dangerous 2.5, coming to you courtesy of the One in 1990. It's not seasonal, but the screens here are original, and every bit as brutal and unfair as screens you'd find in a full Rick Dangerous game. Perfect for those who like their festive seasons to be filled with frustration, anger, and torment. Thankfully, there were other folks who would provide some original Christmas-related goodies aside from the ones behind Lemmings. How's about an all-new level of Graft Gold's brilliant platformer, Fire and Ice? That's another one from the cover of Amiga Power, this time from 1992. Fire and Ice does have more than a few wintry themes about it in the first place, which makes it quite a decent candidate for this sort of thing, and thankfully Graft Gold didn't disappoint. Another very cool one is the Christmas edition of Bullfrog's Theme Park, which you could find on a 1994 CU Amiga cover. You actually do get a pared down version of the full game here, where you can screw around in a typically snowy field and put down a few seasonal items, a Santa's grotto, a few Christmas trees, an appropriate entertainer, a snowman security guard. It's quite sweet, and it's even a demo you can play for a little bit of time, although there's only a few items to actually put down on the ground. Pretty generous, really. Fancy a bit of racing around for the season? Well, how's about this little twinkling level of Team 17's all-terrain racing, available on the 95 Amiga format? It's a pretty decent little top-down racer, and the track has the expected amount of festive accoutrements. And of course there's Cannon Soccer from Sensible Software, a glorious festive fusion of two classics, where our brave soldiers can take on two pretty bloody difficult special levels. One where you blast footballers on a pitch while a chopper chases you, and another difficult ascent where you're peppered by spearmen, gun nests, and even more choppers. Rather generous again, seeing as these levels will probably take even seasoned veterans of this incredibly fun war a chunk of time to complete. But that's not the only festive offering out there from Jules Jopson Company. We also have to look at the almighty Sensible Soccer itself. While there's not a specifically festive original Sensi Coverdisk title, they were released in the festive period, and one in particular is absolutely outstanding. That being, of course, Sensible Soccer 92-93 meets Bulldog Blighty. I have talked about this one before, but this programme contains 3 takes on England versus Germany, where the first goal wins. The 1994 one is a regular Sensi demo, and so is the 1966 one, except it's played out in black and white. But the real gem is the 1944 demo, where 2 teams of cannon fodder soldiers, this came out a few months before that game was released by the way, kick a grenade about the pitch. It's a grenade that bounces appropriately and is also liable to go off every now and then, killing any player nearby. If this goes on for any amount of time, the pitch is probably going to be pretty bloody empty by the time someone actually scores. This is just a fantastic little minigame. It's so silly and so good that you almost wish it had been part of the main game in some form or another. And there's also Sensible Moon of Soccer, a SWAS-based demo that appeared on an Amiga Action cover in 1995. Not quite as cool as the grenade game, but you do get an appropriately crater-filled pitch and an appropriately floaty ball, usually resulting in plenty of goals. It's also quite a meaty demo, seeing as you can choose to play through a whole season of the Moon League, with all the garbled alien-speak teams and players at your disposal. What's next? Well, of course, you've got the few totally original games from established developers. Bullfrog raises their heads again here, bringing people a rather obscure Psycho Santa from 1992. This tiny little game, a shoot 'em up in the mould of Defender and Fantasy Zone, features cute little graphics from Gary Carr and coding by the young Mike Diskette, the guy who won the company's Amiga Power competition to earn a job with the company and later went on to head up Syndicate Wars. Santa may not be as psychotic as the title suggests, he's throwing snowballs at evil demons rather than going on a Grand Theft Auto style rampage in his grotto, but it's a fun little distraction. Here's another. Stavros Fasoulas, most famous on the system for Elfmania, gives us Galactic, a rather wild take on the arena shooter where there's always a lot going on. Not quite on a Jeff Minter level perhaps, but in a similar ballpark. It's the sort of game where I don't have too much of an idea of what's actually going on, but it's still okay regardless of that. And regular readers of Amiga Action, those poor souls, can also enjoy a Christmassy version of regular Coverdisk game Charlie the Chimp, an Amos-made title that's not actually bad at all. One of those single-screen games where you have to cover all the blocks while avoiding the enemies and finding the best path through the special floor tiles. It's perfectly nice and okay, really. Not at all bad for the price of the magazine. Finally, we have a couple of odd selections. Not necessarily Christmassy games, but things you might not find a lot of outside the season. It's hardly uncommon for the magazines of the day to feature public domain titles. There's lots of them, and sometimes you'd get some pretty bloody good ones in the Christmas issues, such as Bubblegum right here. Sometimes though you might get another public domain treat that's pretty famous indeed. How do you fancy playing Donkey Kong on your Amiga? Well, here you are. Have yourself a perfectly good Amiga conversion of the game that's ported from the C64 version, produced by legendary scene name BitBoy in a couple of weeks, and stuck slap bang on the front of Amiga Action in 1992. Yes, it's Donkey Kong. There's no attempt whatsoever to hide it. It even has a couple of extras. A completely original 5th level, and also, Pauline gradually loses her clothes as the timer ticks down, cause 4 pixels are bloody sexy innit? You may be wondering how on earth Amiga Action and Europress didn't get sued into absolute oblivion by Nintendo for selling frickin' Donkey Kong on the front of their mag. I can only put that down to a lack of awareness, really. 'Twas the Wild West back in those days. Donkey Kong might not have much that's festive about it, but I can't think of any other time when I'd be covering this little thing here, and I did play it a lot back in the day. Lastly, here's a question. Why aren't we seeing a whole lot of what would perhaps be the biggest proper gift of all from the cover discs? A full commercial game. That happened quite a lot in the 8-bit days after all. Magazines were chock full of old titles that software houses wanted to squeeze a final bit of cash out of by selling them to the magazine publishers. It's not like there wasn't enough room on the cover for them. Abundance rejoices for those who love floppy disks at this time of the year, when the usual selection of 1 or 2 floppies on a cover is replaced by 3 discs, or even 4 in the case of one particular issue of Amiga Action. The cover is basically nothing but discs. Those who are fonder of the glory days of Oliver Frey and magazine covers that were crafted with soul, love and care may well have kittens at such things. And all I can say to those people is that there are far worse examples of cover design to come. Anywho, with regards to the question, while there were a couple of salvos of full games on covers in the early 90s, in particular with Amiga Power garnering major attention by throwing Bombuzal and Kid Gloves onto their first 2 issues in 1991, for most of the Amiga's prime years there was a sort of uneasy detente, a gentleman's agreement if you will, not to repeat the chaotic last years of the Specky magazines and the like, to try and avoid a repeat of the cover tape wars. There were still a couple of examples, but this largely stuck for most of the time. Mind you, when it comes to 1995 and the rapid, inexorable commercial decline of the computer, we start to reach a stage where anything goes once again. Sort of anyways. The last thing I want to look at here, briefly, is the strange case of a game sold by a magazine as the ultimate complete Christmas gift for your Miggy, a game called Hollywood Hustler. You may wonder what on earth Hollywood Hustler is, and, well, it's a poker game with some ugly digitised sprites that was originally only available through mail order and largely ignored by everyone, with the exception of the one. Now, an important note, this isn't the classic EMAP version of the magazine that shone through the Amiga's glory days. This is the pitiful zombified version, published by Maverick and shat out in the Amiga's final days. This game is almost a definitive example of the awfulness of the Maverick version. Presumably they acquired it from Desert Star and paid a bit of dosh for it. They then proceeded to slather it through several issues. There's a Hollywood Hustler preview for a game that was already available. There's a 4-page review of a game that previously had little to no coverage, and what little there was negative. And finally, at Christmas, there's the complete game for the festive edition of the Maverick one, with perhaps the single ugliest front cover in the history of publication to go with it. As it is, certain bouts of cringiness aside, Hollywood Hustler is just a so-so bit of poker with only window dressing to take it beyond the most basic of PD card games. Not great, not even good really, but not especially offensive. But here's the Maverick version of the one, treating it like it's one of the big releases of 1995. Yes, this is the sort of crap that could happen in the dying years of the computer. It's a bit of a deep rabbit hole indeed, one that may warrant further inspection. And well, there you go. A little look at some of the seasonal Christmas treats that you could expect to find on the front cover of an Amiga magazine, whether you were carefully prizing the disc off the cover in order to not cause any damage to the art, or you were callously tearing the floppy off the front of the mag at the shop while the security guard wasn't looking. There were certainly some good things to be found, generally speaking. If nothing else, you usually got a whole bunch of demos and utilities and the like, plenty enough for anyone to be getting on with. But in the end, it's the more unique stuff that sticks out in the memory, isn't it? Well, for this month of the year anyways. And with that, it's time to hope that you enjoyed the vid, that you have a holly jolly Christmas, and to say, once again, bye for now. Top banana may be harmful to those who suffer photosensitive epilepsy. Today's video is a bad game quite unlike any other one I've covered. Again, there's more here than just the usual naff controls or broken coding or whatever. Rather than being so bad it's good, or just so bad it's bad, this is a game that's so bad it's, well, unsettling. Something that legitimately gives you that weird feeling in the pit of your stomach, even as you struggle with all the dreadful graphics, sound and gameplay that it's throwing at you. Hex and Psychor's Top Banana, originally from 1991, may well fail in many of the traditional ways that you'd see in any plain old lousy title, but in other areas, it carves out a path entirely of its own. Hell, some of what it's trying to do is actually laudable, whether it's being a representation of early 90s rave culture, or being an environmental game that actually practices what it preaches. But the game itself, well, that's something that cannot be excused. And after you've finished playing it, you may well feel like giving your computer an exorcism. The story behind Top Banana isn't completely outrageous, although it does feature a couple of people you may know, especially if you're familiar with the aforementioned rave and dance scene of the early 90s in the UK. If you know names like Hex and Coldcut, then you'll be happy to hear that they're amongst the main forces behind this game. Hex being a group consisting of Coldcut's Matt Black and Jonathan Moore, the artist Robert Pepperell, and a coder named Miles Visman, who headed up a small studio named Psychor. Psychor's main focus was on games for the Acorn Archimedes, and that's where Top Banana was first released in '91. But Top Banana certainly doesn't represent the entirety of Hex's works. There's all sorts of videos, music that came out under the label Ninja Tune, exhibitions. There's plenty of interesting stuff here, and for Hex, computer games were something else to experiment with, seeing if they could take some of the practices you would find in the world of rave and transfer them to the world of gaming. So yeah, this isn't necessarily a confused mess, or a typical story of a game gone wrong. Hex were very sure of their vision. Hell, they executed that vision. It's just perhaps not to the taste of, well, most games playing folk. What we're currently seeing at the moment is a 1992 video for the song Global Chaos. Pretty fabulous stuff, something that takes you right back to the era. This video features a rather Betty Boop-esque cartoon girl called KT, and she is also the heroine of Top Banana. I do believe you would also get this music, or perhaps a few mixes of it, on a 12-inch that came bundled in with the game itself. So Top Banana is an environmentally themed game, and again it's an environmental game with a strong vision. KT must, to paraphrase the manual, combat the forces that are tilting the world into oblivion by using the power of love to repel the agents of destruction. If you succeed, you will be able to seek ultimate wisdom in the mindscape and achieve the status of Top Banana. Rather high concept stuff. The game certainly takes itself seriously, there's no doubt about it, but where so many other environmentally themed games have ended up being ludicrously cringeworthy, Top Banana does kind of succeed here. KT, at least outside of the game, is a very nice looking character. Using love to conquer the forces of evil? That's a pretty strong gaming theme. And I mentioned Hex practicing what they preach. Top Banana, as well as being sold at 26 quid, was also sold in recycled cardboard packaging, something they used as a selling point because it hadn't been done before. Hell, just doing that alone is enough to knock abject wastes of material like Awesome Possum and Captain Planet directly into a cocked hat. It even boasts of having uncompressed graphics that you could edit yourself, use for your own personal version of Top Banana. Hell, maybe you could call it a recyclable game. Now you could see all of this being the makings of a pretty neat title. But, well, this is anything but that. Let's be straight, Top Banana is not good. Even if it means well, even if the project had some unique concepts, the game itself is an unforgivable disaster, and it's about time to go through the reasons why. While the game's original release was on a Archimedes, and we will look at that later, we are mainly looking at the Amiga version for now. Top Banana was released for both the Amiga and the Atari ST in 1992, with it also getting a release on the CD-TV as part of a Hex CD-ROM called Global Chaos. So the best part of the game is its introductory video. Again, that's something you don't usually see on an early 90s Amiga game, and it's got the same aesthetic as you would find from other works by Hex, Cold Cut, or their video production outfit Hardwire. It's low res and it is certainly kind of creepy, but it looks pretty cool, and it sounds good as well. Once you get through that and the copy protection, you then get to the game and oh my god, my eyes! There's no need to adjust anything, or write a comment saying that I'm clearly playing a bugged copy of the game. If you've never played Top Banana before, this is exactly what it's supposed to look like. It was utterly intended to be this much of an absolute garbled mess. This is a world that's rotting via pollution, and these graphics are how that's portrayed. They made a choice here. I can't think of too many other games that look like Top Banana, and I imagine that for 99% of people that's probably a good thing. It's like if you tried to speedrun making a collage in primary school after accidentally getting a big whiff of Pritt stick up your nostrils. Nothing at all stands out. I don't blame you if you're wondering where the enemies even are, but they're certainly moving around. Again, they all appear to be ripped from who knows where. This is all about taking the concept of sampling, the weird sounds and music that you would find in a DJ set or whatever, and trying to do that in a game. And that's a really cool idea. But I think if you took this concept the other way and translated the graphics of Top Banana into music, you'd end up with something that makes Metal Machine music by Lou Reed sound like Val Bloody Doonican. It is aggressive. Again, what else is even like this? Maybe the legendary Sexy Hiking and its famous successor, Getting Over It? I don't know. Even then it feels like Top Banana is on a whole other plane of existence. Top Banana may be more frustrating than Getting Over It, actually. The graphics are one big thing, but I've yet to get into the gameplay and, oh boy. You've probably already figured out that this is a take on the classic Rainbow Islands formula. You need to get KT to the top of each level before you get taken out by the rising water, due to melting ice caps, naturally, picking up food and shooting the enemies with your love as you go. Simple enough, but it is broken beyond belief. The movement itself is incredibly slippy, while the jumping is actually kind of stiff. You can move around when you jump, but you are rather fixed when it comes to how high you can go. This This can make it very hard to judge a lot of the jumps, especially when you combine that with the platforms being kind of hard to even bloody see. The enemies don't help either, seeing as they mostly move very fast. You get pretty much the same set of enemies in each world, only with different sprites. There's bulldozers and chainsaws in the rainforest along with acid rain that tracks you, and you get other themed enemies like robots and radioactive waste in the metal city, or clowns in the temple. And they can definitely be hard to avoid. The most common way you get hit is when you're jumping and the top of your head ends up just clipping an enemy on a platform that you didn't even see. And whenever you get hit, you drop through a couple of the platforms. By the way, you get 5 hits total to play with, there's no energy pickups, your health doesn't refill between stages, and you only get 1 life to go through all of the game's 12 stages. Difficulty wise, this game is a monster. And it is difficult in the worst way. Even getting through the first 3 forest levels is hard enough, and I've had to use a trainer to actually show you the rest because it's such a nightmare. Every 3 stages, you get a boss. These are mostly simple and again Rainbow Islands-esque in the way they move around, although it's obviously another chance for the game to throw even more weird and not so wonderful images at your face, whether it be an Oliver Hardy looking guy with dollar signs floating around his head, or a spider in a bike helmet. It's very random, innit? Very surreal. It'll freak 'em out. The ridiculous level of difficulty, combined with the visceral unpleasantness of the title, means that the majority of people have never ventured beyond the first couple of levels in Top Banana. That's more than enough for most anyone to damn the game utterly and never touch it again. However, I am here to say that, yep, the game gets worse. A lot worse. Naturally, it only gets even harder as it goes. Even with infinite energy, it still took a long time to get past some of the sections in the game just because of how packed they are with enemies, and how precise you have to be with controls that are so bad. But then there's the disappearing platforms. That's always a good laugh. There's the lifts that you can occasionally use. Some of these are hilariously broken in that when you're on one, it can be possible to jump while just standing on nothing if you hammer up enough. Hell, there's a couple of times when I pretty much had to do that in order to keep going. And worst of all, there's the polluted water sections. You know when you hit one of these because the screen suddenly turns negative. Just in case you thought Top Banana couldn't possibly look less appealing, the game surprises you further. Oh, and it also moves at half the speed during these sections, because just when you thought Top Banana couldn't possibly be less playable, it surprises you again. You also have to get out of these sections pretty sharpish, otherwise you'll just start taking hits. I have no words for this. I thought the game had completely bugged out when I first came to one of these bits, only to realise after a couple seconds that, again, this was a choice. This is exactly as intended. Quite incredible, really. So when you've put all of this together, the eyesore jumbled mess of graphics and this botched up gameplay, what's the best thing to soundtrack it all with? Yes, obviously the sound effects are another level of horrific. There's not really any music as such beyond the video intro, but every stage does have its own bed of sound, all of which are once again samples. There's some you may well even recognise, such as the start of every stage kicking in with the buzzer sound from Catchphrase. But the sounds are... they're all over the place. There's the strange grunt Katie makes whenever she picks up an item, and there are lots of items. That doesn't even sound human. The synth stabby sound she makes when firing her hearts is pretty damn obnoxious as well, and the drill when she takes a hit, horribly annoying. And these are the main sounds that you will constantly hear throughout the whole game. You get the constant hum of whatever stage you're in as well. The forest is a generic enough waterfall, but when you get to later worlds, well, just listen to the temple. This is the sort of thing that makes this game a whole other level of bad, something that is actually highly creepy. I have heard people refer to Top Banana as something not far away from a horror game, and worlds such as the Temple and the final Mindscape definitely wouldn't be out of place there. This is legitimately weird as all hell, and combined with the gameplay, not to mention the rather, shall we say, dilated state of Katie here in this game, with those eyes and what have you, it's not a pleasant experience. But not in a good horror game way, more in a making me actively feel sick kind of way. And that's before you eat a mushroom power-up that reverses the frigging controls on you. Now, I'm admittedly not much of a drug person. I took a triple sod once, but I certainly didn't swallow it. But is this what a bad trip feels like? Was that the true motivation behind Top Banana? Is it secretly anti-rave culture, designed to make people chuck out the glow sticks and start voting Conservative? Nah, I think I'm clutching at straws here. There is no upper meaning to be found. It should perhaps be no surprise that Katie's reward for enduring this whole ordeal, once she has reached the end of the Mindscape and defeated the Psych Sphere of Enlightenment, is a single screen. Although of course, it's still rather strange. You get a representation of a human made out of a bunch of beads, looking like a particularly ropey Pinterest creation. Eventually you get the same evil laugh you get when you game over, and you smash cut straight to the high scores. What does it even mean? Is this what happens when you reach enlightenment? Is this what's going to greet us when we die? Is this the mark of being a top banana? Who knows? As I finally reached this screen and reflected on the past hour of sludgery, I wondered if Top Banana was the sort of game that Super Hands would have made during a weekend of looking into the mirror. Now, I mean no disrespect to the people involved. They've done great things over many years, created art, made some pretty banging tunes and all that. Hell, I almost admire how uncompromising Top Banana is in its vision. I don't think there's any part of the game that isn't exactly as intended. They made these choices. But on the other hand, well, they made these choices, and they cannot be forgiven. I would happily listen, thoroughly interested, to the folks behind this game talk for ages about the whole thought processes that went behind it. But I'd still probably want to slap them with a piss-soaked glove at the end of the conversation just for the sheer unpleasantness of playing the bloody thing. There were only a few reviews of the Amiga version of Top Banana, and it may not have gotten the kick-in from mags you might have expected. A lot of people were surprised that Top Banana wasn't in my worst reviewed games in Amiga Power video, thinking it would surely have made the 10% or less category. However, it actually got 45% from them. Jonathan Davis's review is pretty damn negative on the whole, dismissing it as a bad Rainbow Islands clone, although it does make a note of the environmentally friendly packaging. Amiga Action, the sworn enemies of Amiga Power, only went 10 points higher. Again, they did note the packaging and wanted to give it a better score because of Hexa's earnestness and their beliefs, but they couldn't excuse the game itself. The Wild Swedes over at Dator magazine actually gave it 75%, easily the highest available score for an Amiga version, and they barely even mentioned the bloody theme. Maybe they actually liked it. The most negative thing they have to say is that it's a bit messy on the screen sometimes, which is possibly the understatement of the last century. Top Banana actually got the biggest kick-in from Germany's Amiga Joker, who gave it 16%. They said it was almost unplayable, heartily unoriginal, and acoustically unbearable, concluding by saying that it'd be more exciting and environmentally sensible to pick up rubbish in the park. On the whole, it's fair to say that our British critics didn't know quite what to make of it. There's a couple of things that are a bit worthy of praise, but none of them were actually in the damned game. And the claims on the box of it being comparable to Mario and Sonic, or of it containing juicy addictive coin-op action? The less said about those, the better. Now, we're not quite finished yet. There are a couple more things to look at. Top Banana is most famous as an Amiga game, and that's what we've been looking at. But the game is actually a port. Originally it was on the Acorn Archimedes in 1991, and there are a couple of differences. The most notable one, weirdly, is in something found in the marketing for the Amiga version. Remember all the stuff about being able to edit the game's sprites and tile sets? Well, as far as I can tell, that's kind of difficult to do in the Amiga version, if it's even possible at all. From what I've seen on forums, no one's had much luck doing it if anyone's really even tried, because you need to cut the graphics out, then when you fiddle with them it buggers up the checksum and it all goes to hell and... I mean, you would have thought if it's pushed as a feature, it probably wouldn't be that difficult to do. Therefore, I don't think the functionality for editing graphics is on the MIGI version. However, on the Archimedes original, well, it's totally easy. All the graphics are there in their uncompressed glory, there's a little readme telling you exactly what to do, and you can just open them straight up in the Arc's default paint program and go to town if you want. Just to demonstrate briefly, I have given Katie hair that rapidly changes colour. Actually looks kind of neat when she's falling. So yes, theoretically you can change every last bit of graphics in the game on the Archimedes to whatever you damn well please, which is admittedly a cool feature, even if it is obvious why most games wouldn't let you do this. As for the game itself, well, that's pretty much the same. It's still top banana, and it's still very bad. I think the look of the game is slightly cleaner on Archimedes, although that is relative to the Amiga version. It is still quite nasty. Magazines such as Acorn User were certainly more welcoming towards the games than the Amiga mags were, with one particular publication, the Micro User, being, well, very positive. They gave it 95%. Now I know that good games were a bit thinner on the ground here in Arkland, not as many people working on them, but bloody hell! Shockingly, there's a full-page ad for Top Banana just a couple of pages on from the review. Oh, and the Archimedes version of the game also came with a t-shirt. I imagine that at least must be a pretty freaking rare item. What else is there? Well, there are two other games by Psycor on the Acorn Archimedes. It is the usual conundrum. We are moving outside of the world of Top Banana, but when else am I going to look at these titles? Is there perhaps a similar level of horror in them, or are we going to find another sort of surprise? So let's have a quick little look at Big Ban and Revolver. It looks as though both of these games came out quite a while after Top Banana, possibly in 1995, and I need to thank Doc Wallace for making me aware of them. Big Ban is first, it's another platformer and yeah, even if you didn't know that this game was from the same brain as Top Banana, you would probably be able to tell. It is, once again, absolutely weird as anything. This is a collect 'em up of sorts where you go around maze-like levels in order to grab all the stuff and find the goal, but the presentation is... I mean, again, it ends up feeling creepy and sinister more than anything. There's something wholly unsettling about the wild look on our hero's face, the occasional purposefully glitchy effects it uses, and the various pickups that change the colours, or warp the stage, or add mirror effects. This is very odd indeed. Graphically, it's not as complete of a mess as Top Banana is, but it's certainly the same aesthetic where everything is sampled, taken from elsewhere and thrown in randomly. And yeah, the sound effects and music certainly do add to that creepiness level. It definitely feels like another rave sort of game, something else where you're thrown right into the thick of the culture. It makes the likes of the Bitmap's Magic Pockets look utterly staid in comparison. But is it good? It's a better game than Top Banana, but it's still quite irritating indeed to actually play. The other game here is Revolver, and, well, in a way this is the most conventional of all of Psycor's titles, but that doesn't mean it's not wild. What we have here is basically a take on Taito's Camel Try, only here you have a maze that you've got to navigate, and a bunch more pickups that you need to grab before hitting the goal, all inside a time limit and while avoiding various obstacles and traps in your way that'll run the clock down. Now of course this wouldn't be Psycor if there wasn't more wild sound effects, a load of rapping graphics, hence the name, another chance to edit all the sprites and the sounds, and some more ravey presentation. But yeah, This game's perfectly fine. It controls pretty well with the left and middle buttons of the mouse, and you can even throw a map up on the screen with the right button if you are well and truly lost. Or, as the readme says, you can simply throw yourself over to chance and lose everything in this game-stroke-art exhibit. It's certainly the sort of thing you can imagine seeing in a VJ set, and hey, it's a pretty cool game. And well, that about closes the book on Top Banana and these other little bonus games. The pigs have unfortunately arrived on the scene, they're smashing up the sound system, and this video's wrapping up. Now it's certainly been something. Obviously, I cannot in any way recommend Top Banana. It is an absolutely horrible game to play, and it's unpleasant to look at to say the least. But it is certainly different enough that you should probably give it a go at least once, just to see it for yourself. Just to experience, at least until it starts to make you feel a bit queasy. Then you should turn it off and immediately try to forget. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little video, and until the next time, bye for now. Usually when I'm talking about platformers on the Amiga, I'm talking about pretty bad games, whether they be lousy ripoffs of another more famous title, or some dreadful creation that got completely blasted by Amiga power or Amiga format or whatever. It's about time to redress the balance somewhat, so let's talk about a good platformer for a change. And this game here is one of my favourites on the whole computer, Arabian Nights. This is a gem of a title made by Creepiest in 1993, the sort that largely contains all of the good things about the oft-maligned Euro platformer subgenre and wraps it up in a neat little package, while also clearly being influenced heavily by the world of consoles. Unlike a lot of its contemporaries, Arabian Nights is the sort of game where, if you showed it to someone who wasn't aware of it, they may not be able to guess immediately that it's running on an Amiga. Indeed, it's one of those fantastic games that perhaps generally too many people aren't aware of, and so I would like to try and redress the balance a little. So, let's dive into it. As previously mentioned, Arabian Nights is a Creepiest software game, the Sheffield-based studio largely made up of ex-Gremlin Graphics people, previously largely known as Teak, and the sort of 90s studio that don't always make the best games, but when they hit pretty damn hard. A lot of Creepiest's work involved working on the audio for Sega Mega Drive games. One of their founders, Sean Hollingworth, made a sound driver for the MD that was used in quite a few games, usually producing excellent results, especially seeing as it was often used by the studio's main composer, Matt Furness. As far as the games themselves go, a lot of their more successful original efforts were based around sports, usually of the licensed variety. Wiley got a license for Jahangir Khan and used it to bring a squash game to market. That was actually a decent effort, and a hit, although their biggest license by far was for Manchester United. The 3 Red Devils-centric footy games they made in the early 90s are certainly amongst Creepiest's most famous and most successful titles, even if they aren't their best. Anyway, we can't really talk about Arabian Nights without first mentioning another one of the studio's best known games, one that combined the worlds of footballing and platforming into a neat little package, that being Soccer Kid. Even if the two games were actually worked on by largely different teams, the similarities between them are readily apparent the moment you look at them. And while Arabian Nights actually came out first, Soccer Kid, or Kid Cleats if you're an American SNES owner, was in development for longer thanks to several delays. The origins for this footy-based actioner actually spawned from one of the studio's earlier titles, the rather okay puzzle-based 1990 platformer Mad Professor Moriarty. According to Matt Furness in a 2024 interview with the Retro Hour, when ideas were being bandied around for a potential sequel to this game, a guy called Dean Lester, then head of Teak's London studio, said that perhaps the Professor should be kicking a ball about. While plans for a Moriarty sequel were soon scrapped, it's this little idea that provided the genesis for what would become Soccer Kid, which was originally known as Football Kid. A bunch of the studio's best and brightest worked on it. Furnace, while also providing the music as normal, also had a large hand in designing the game alongside coder Nigel Little. More design as well as the fabulous graphics and animation come from Neil Adamson, and then you've got battle-hardened old veterans, Peter Harrop and Sean Hollingworth also dealing with the programming. Soccer Kid proved to be a hit when it came out in late 1993, a fine game where it takes a little while to get a hand of the football-based mechanics that pepper the action, but it's quite rewarding once you do. It was enough of a hit that it certainly inspired a couple of other studios to create footy-centric platformers of their own, such as Domark's Marco's Magic Football, or US Gold's licensed game based on the Hurricanes cartoon. Neither of these are anywhere near as good as Soccer Kid. But as mentioned, Arabian Nights came first, a few months before Soccer Kid, in the spring of 1993. Now, there's not a whole lot of detail on the game's development, but it's mentioned in a Retro Gamer article on Chrysalis that the idea for the game came from Tony Kavanagh, one of Chrysalis's co-founders. It's easy to say that the success of Disney's Aladdin film in 1992 probably had something to do with the game's creation, and one imagines it certainly helped. But then this sort of medieval Middle Eastern setting was already a fertile ground for smash hits, what with the almighty Prince of Persia and all that. In the words of the One Amiga's preview, Arabian Nights, which was originally known as Sinbad Jr., feels like a nice little game to tide people over while Soccer Kid, which again got delayed a bit, gets finished. Still, that feels a bit unfair considering the game's just as good on the quality front, if not better. A relatively small and almost wholly different team worked on Arabian Nights, presumably using either the same or a very similar engine to the one that was used for Soccer Kid. We've got Simeon Pashley and Martin Hebden working on the designing and coding. Hebden's also doing most of the art, and Matt Furnace is on the Sonics. That's largely it. Most of Arabian Nights was created by this trio, with a couple of extra credits for the bosses and for the introductory animation, done by Philip Hackney and Les Newstead respectively. The game's plot is simple stuff, but it's delivered well in the intro. You are Sinbad Jr., and your life is spent toiling away in the palace's gardens as a second-class helper of the gardener's assistant. Work is hard, but you live for the glimpses of the beautiful Princess Layla on the palace's balcony. And then, one fateful day, the vizier's demon comes along and kidnaps her. After trying but failing to stop the kidnapping, you're blamed for the princess's capture and thrown into the dungeons. And thus, your journey begins, escaping, getting a magic carpet, defeating the elemental djinns to obtain access to the vizier's ice palace, vanquishing him, and rescuing Layla. All nice and straightforward, of course. If I had a penny for every European platformer that involved rescuing a fair maiden, well, I wouldn't be rich, but I'd probably have enough money to buy a pint in central London. Arabian Nights uses this plot to bounce our brave hero through 9 levels, and they cover a pretty wide range. Some of them are based around solving puzzles, others are a trifle more actiony, we take a trip underwater, we race around in a minecart, and there's a couple of flying stages too. So no matter what your platforming preference is, chances are pretty good that you'll find something you enjoy here. Indeed, you may well find a lot. Arabian Nights is, for the most part, pretty damn good at all the things it throws at you, and happily it's not the usual Euro platform cliché of aimlessly running about and trying to achieve some quota of gems or coins or chupa chups or whatever in order for an exit to open. Instead, Arabian Nights actually makes exploration rewarding. The main thing that links all of the levels together, regardless of their style, is that there's usually a lot of hidden areas and secrets to find. Sometimes these secrets simply hide currency and points, but there are a lot of collectibles, over 30 in fact. Aside from the usual energy bar increases, extra lives and the like, you can also get permanent energy bar upgrades, upgrades to your movement or your trusty sword, temporary power-ups and various other assorted goodies. Of course, you'll also need the odd item for the quest itself, whenever you come across a little puzzle, most of which are in the classic tradition of something like Dizzy. Nothing that's particularly obscure, just simple logical stuff like finding water in order to make a plant grow, or finding something suitably stiff that can be used to stick into a hole, take some chains down, and rescue a prisoner. You get a percentage score at the end of each level that corresponds to how much you discovered, and while there's no special ending for 100% in every level or anything like that, it's still worthwhile. You can go through the levels as quickly as you like, but generally they're levels that aren't so long that they outstay their welcome, but they're also not mind-numbingly shallow and straightforward. It's a very cleverly designed little game, happily one of those where you really want to play the levels a hell of a lot more than just once. All that's well and good, but Arabian Nights is also a damn good mover. So often it's the case in a European platformer, particularly one with smatterings of the age-old arcade adventure micro-genre like this one, that the interesting levels are handicapped by frustrating controls where you're too fast, you're too slow, the jump-in's all wonky and so on. Here though, well, it's just right. Just right in the sense of playing a perfectly good console game in that there's nothing spectacular to say. Sinbad moves at a decent pace, there's the right amount of Mario-esque momentum, and his jumps are very controllable. And he can even defend himself. Sinbad has a sword for that purpose. Usually his best tactic is to lure the enemy into attacking, and then coming back in for a quick swipe. It's a little Prince of Persia-esque in this regard, or at least it certainly feels like it in the first dungeon level, which is a cartoonier homage to Mechler's classic where you're taking out those guards and avoiding the odd trap while learning the game's ropes. Getting caught in a trap, isn't necessarily fatal. This isn't one of those Euro platform games where a sudden fall into spikes equals instant death, as you have an energy bar and you're almost always able to get out and try again. If you do cop it, then you don't usually get sent back all that far, and you start with a maximum of 5 lives. Still, there are no continues, so there is a bit of bite there, although that doesn't matter quite as much when the game doesn't feel like a slog. On the difficulty front, yeah, there's a fair bit of that. The first couple of levels start you off easy enough, but it does ramp up quite sharpish once you get into the maze-like galleon and the mines, and the last couple of stages are seriously not going to muck about. The final stage in the Vizier's Ice Palace is obviously pretty large, full of the toughest enemies and, well, it's an ice level, so obviously it's going to be a challenge from the get-go. But happily it's a challenge that's at the end, where it should be. There are only the odd parts where the game does fall down a little. In particular, the 2 magic carpet stages. Yeah, these are pretty damn rubbish. Having momentum on the carpet in these shoot-em-up stages is very annoying indeed. There's not much to shout about here on the graphical front, and all the enemies tend to take far too many hits to actually blow up, so you're better off just trying to avoid them as opposed to engaging with them, which simply isn't going to do. The minecart stage is also a bit of a pain. While you don't actually have to win the race against the unmanned cart you're up against, there is a time limit, and it can be a pain to actually stay on the damn thing, although the level is short. But the underwater stage, now that's actually a damn good one. You get to swim about and do a lot of exploring, and young Sinbad here just so happens to have unlimited lung capacity, so there's no risk of drowning. So while the diversions into areas like shoot-em-ups and racing, of a sort, do fall down here as they often do in platform games, especially Euro ones, Arabian Nights does manage to nail the underwater level when a lot of other platformers don't. And then you have the bosses. These are pretty nondescript on the whole, simple enough once you've figured them out, and that doesn't take too long. Far from the best part of the game, but they aren't offensive. Graphics-wise, the game is fine. As can surely be seen, it's pretty close in style to Soccer Kid, particularly when it comes to the main sprite. Undeniably, Soccer Kid has busier, more detailed and generally better graphics, and that hero obviously has more animation, seeing as he's got the ball to kick about and all of that. But while Arabian Nights isn't necessarily the best looking platformer in the world, it's not bad in the slightest. Indeed, the graphics are nice without being busy, and not filled with endless layers of parallax that can sometimes interfere with the action. I mean, geez. What with this game only having parallax scrolling in things like the background where they don't get in the way, sometimes you wonder if Arabian Nights is actually of European origin. Is it all some sort of trick? A bit of flim-flammery disguising the presence of guys from a country that actually knows how to make platform games? All of that said, the best thing about the whole game, I think that might well be the music. Now it's funny how this is so often the case when a certain Matt Furness is involved. He is quite like Tim Follin in that there are plenty of generally middling games, or even terrible ones, that are worth firing up simply for his soundtrack alone. This is often the case for his work on Mega Drive titles. Here though, we have a case where the quality of the game is a match for his sublime sonics, and it's a beautiful partnership indeed. It's so often the case for games with this sort of setting to feature nothing but a load of cliched Middle Eastern motifs, all at mock sitar and what have you, and while those sort of melodies are dotted around, they're incorporated into a heart-pumping and speedy soundtrack that pairs perfectly with the action. And, unlike so many Amiga games, you get both the music and the sound effects, and you don't have to choose between one or the other. And this is A500, it's not an ARGA game or anything like that. I honestly reckon it's one of Matt Furness's best ever soundtracks, even if it isn't necessarily one of his best known ones. But then this isn't necessarily one of the best known games, which is quite the shame. The game itself did fine, particularly on the critics front. Every one of the major British mags gave Arabian Nights scores between 90% and 80% without exception, a feat that the game repeated the following year when it was re-released onto the CD32. With this game, as well as Soccer Kid, which got even better critical notes, Creepiest showed just how good they could be in the world of platformers, and in retrospect you really wish they'd made more of them. While they concentrated so much on sports titles, and that business did well through the 90s, these games are absolute bangers to the point where if Creepiest had made more like them, they may be thought of in the same breadth as the likes of the bitmaps, and that's not something I'd say lightly. It obviously doesn't help that the game never left the Amiga. Its only console appearance was, as mentioned, on the CD32, and as is often the case, that version is just about identical to the original floppy disk version. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of work on a Mega Drive or SNES version, so one presumes that it simply wasn't considered. It's not an odd mystery title like the Mega Drive version of Soccer Kid, something that was actually reviewed in one of the magazines before disappearing into the void, yet to be recovered. Still, this is absolutely a platformer you should go and play, even if you have a general distaste for the European style. There's enough that's different from the norm, and more than enough that's special about Arabian Nights to make it worth anyone's while. For my money, it's one of the best platformers you can get on the Miggy. And, well, it's simply nice to cover a good platformer on the computer for a change. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little video, and until the next time, bye for now. So it turned out that you folks got quite a kick out of seeing a load of old ports of Sega arcade games to the ZX Spectrum. And hey, thanks for that. It's always nice when something from the old British micro that I enjoy so much gets people watching. Naturally, there were plenty of requests to follow up on this and look at Sega arcade ports to other micro platforms, or indeed to look at how other companies like Capcom or Taito fared on the humble Specky. We'll definitely get to that, but for now, well, let's see how Sega arcades came across on a platform that, in theory, should be more capable of handling a bunch of them. It's time for some Sega arcades on the Amiga. Now, I did and ah a little bit about making this vid, actually, for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that there isn't a lot of different games here. With the exception of a couple of first-party Mega Drive to Amiga ones, all the games here are ones we saw in the Specky vid. In fact, there's a bit less. However, there's worth in looking at the quality of the 16-bit ports compared to the 8-bit ones, especially considering they're done by largely the same studios. You'll be surprised at what you'll find, and not necessarily in a good way. Yes, I have to say that you probably shouldn't expect the very best of the Amiga to be on show here. Some of the games in the last vid definitely got the most out of the Specky, while very few of these games get the most out of the Amiga. All of these games are for the bog standard A500, there's no A1200 ARGA goodness here. A lot of them could derisively be classed as Atari ST ports, meaning it's the same game that you got on the ST, only with different music. And while this doesn't automatically mean a bad game, it means that they don't do much with any of the Amiga's hardware advantages. And much like the Spectrum, these games dry up after around early 1992. Don't expect to see anything later than G-Loc. Why is that? Well, we'll get to that in the end, when we also look at the possibility of a very big game indeed coming to the Amiga and the other micros. Could we have seen a certain spiky blue hedgehog on the computers? We'll find out. For now, well, let's go through these things. I think the best way to go about things this time, rather than the chronological way, is to do more comparisons. Some games here are better than the 8-bit versions, and others are a lot worse, including ones that were amongst the best Specky Sega ports. Here, however, to kick things off, is a little summary of the games that have pretty much remained the same. Aside from obvious graphical differences, they're about as enjoyable, or unenjoyable, as the Spectrum titles. Alien Storm here? It's just as terrible as it is on the Spectrum. I don't know what it is about this game that caused US Gold to put out such rubbish titles that are so completely unresponsive, but this Amiga version has much the same problems as the Specky one had. It's like you have no say on whether your character actually bloody does anything, and it makes for a painfully slow game. Alien Storm should be fast and fun, full of blasting and B-movie kookiness. This is like calling for a muddy field. Utter rubbish. Another one that continues being an abject stinker? Good old eSWAT, an utter misery once again. Actually, it kind of looks the same as the Specky version with the same really quite awful sprites, only they've been coloured in this time. It's one of the worst Specky ports, it's one of the worst Amiga ones, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be utterly friggin' dreadful on the C64, Amstrad and ST too. And as I kind of already alluded to in the Specky version, and as I kind of already alluded to in the Spectrum video, the Amiga version of Thunderblade is just as jerky, uncontrollable, and flat out hideous as its monochrome brethren. Pepsi sure picked a good title to stick their brand on with this one, didn't they? Those three are abject miseries, of course. This little lot here is slightly better, thankfully. Altered Beast's music isn't quite as rocking as the Specky ones, and it is still rather jerky, but this is countered by being a fair bit more playable. In the end though, it's about the same. The Specky version at least shines more in the graphics department. G-Loc is probably a little bit more enjoyable on the whole than it is on the Spectrum, but it's still just rather bare. And again, I should note that it is still called G-Loc R360 here, and that's still quite hilarious. I mean, come off it. And then you have the rather generic shoot-em-ups, Scramble Spirits and Sonic Boom. They weren't exactly bad games on the Spectrum, and they're not exactly bad here. I mean, they're not amazing and you probably won't remember them for too long after playing, but they're acceptable. I suppose you could say the exact same thing about the original arcades. The other game I want to mention here, a bigger game, is Outrun. I decided to put this in the about the same section because, much like the Spectrum, the Amiga version of this game was given a lot of attention, was most certainly hyped, and yes, it was a big disappointment. You start playing it and, Well, it's got the colours and all that, but it is just so jerky. It's the old ST port hoodoo once again, I'm afraid. It does at least have that incredibly weird and overdramatic intro, mind you. The one that GameSack had a lot of fun with.
US Gold present from Sega.
Why did they put this into the game? No idea. Doesn't exactly fit, does it? This port is especially grating because, well, there's some really freaking good racing games on the Amiga. Some of the best you could get at the time. Let's do a bit of comparison. This game was released in 1988. Elite's tremendous and outrageously fun conversion of Buggy Boy, released in the same year. Jeff Crammon's seminal stunt car racer, 1989. Now, those two aren't necessarily like out one, but if you want something that is, well, look no further than the immortal Lotus series, the first of which hit in 1990. So, yeah, with this in mind, the Out One Amiga is a bit of a bloody joke, really. As it goes, the racing games are going to be some of the more interesting ones here, mainly because you have options to control them with the mouse, and indeed that's normally the main option. Driving games with the mouse? Yeah. Seems weird now, but then computer mice back in those days weren't quite as sensitive as the ones we have today. The good old days of a big old ball rattling away in your mouse that you had to clean the pads on often, and had a tendency to come flying out and land in the deep abyss under your desk. No, nobody misses them, do they? Anyway, the mouse driving controls are going to be a bit of a mixed bag. Out One here isn't the best, as you might expect, although it's not the worst that we're going to see either. Right, let's properly get into it. Here's the Amiga ports that are significantly worse than the Spectrum ones. And yeah, some of them have fallen pretty damn far. Why not start with the game that I reckoned was the best of all the Spectrum ports? Power Drift was an absolute belter. It ran great, controlled very well, and was basically everything you could possibly want from an 8-bit version of the game, especially on the Spectrum. I had a little look at the C64 version, and you know what? That's an absolute blinder too. You'd have thought that this game would be way too much for the 8-bits, but no, they got some wonderful little versions of it. Now with this in mind, surely the power of the Amiga's gonna make this even better, right? It'll be better, right? Yes, the worried face of Padme may well flash before your eyes. This port is a complete bloody disaster. Everything about the exceptional 8-bit ports is completely lost here. The jerky movement is beyond the pale. The graphics often interfere with the screen itself, making it very hard to see where you're going, and the courses themselves look so awful that it's really tough just to even follow them. And the controls? Whether you go with a mouse or a joystick, it's so twitchy and haywire. Combine this with the narrow tracks and you've got a game that's just about unplayable. Oh, and the music's dreadful here too. Just horrifying to look at, even worse to play. So the story goes, this version was ported off of an NTSC Atari ST. It went from there to a PAL Amiga with almost no care or attention, and this is the result. It's not just one of the worst ports of this video, it's one of the worst Amiga ports I have ever seen. Alas, Time Scanner has dropped down a fair bit. This isn't the absolute drizzling turds like Power Drift, but yeah, this one's perhaps more a case of context. On the Spectrum, this was one of the best pinball games around, if not the best. But this is the Amiga, and much like WCW, it's where the big boys play. Some of the best pinball games ever were released for this system. And yeah, it almost seems unfair to compare this to something like Pinball Dreams, but alas, I can't help it. A rather simple pinball game with pretty wonky ball physics like this one Can't hope to amount to much on the Amiga, I'm afraid. Action Fighter is another one too. What's pretty good on the Speccy is just really quite janky and choppy on the Amiga, and the faster speed actually makes the game even more of a pain in the arse to play than it normally is. Core Design handled this 16-bit version, much like they did with the 8-bit one, and it's not one of their best. Happily, they do have something better to show off in this video later on. Galaxy Force. It was a miracle that we got such a good version of this on the Speccy. The Amiga version is more in line of what you might expect out of a port of this, being another messy affair. It certainly controls a lot worse, the turns are a complete nightmare to deal with, but the main problem is the atrocious graphics. Power Drift is perhaps an even better example of this, but in both instances, while the 8-bit graphics may not have much colour, they're really nice and clean. These 16-bit graphics have more colour, but they're a mess that actively diminishes your ability to play the bloody thing. Beyond somewhat deceptive screenshots from the magazines, I would hope that it's quite clear which one's better in the visual department. If you think it's the Amiga, you're just bloody wrong, I'm sorry. We have other ports that seem to get fundamentals of the game wrong. I'm really not sure what happened to Crackdown. The Speccy port of this wasn't particularly good either, but the 16-bit one is worse even beyond not having an awesome 10-minute title song. They meddled with the game, zooming it way in. The small sprites are the whole bloody point of this game, allowing you to see a big chunk of the map, see all the enemies, and plan accordingly. Now you can't even really see enemies until they're right on top of you, and to top that off, if you're vaguely close to them, you throw a kick that usually just misses instead of, shooting them in the face. An utter stinker, quite frankly. And then we have Shinobi. Not bad at all on 8-bit, but here, again, it just gets things wrong. A lot of the enemies don't feel right at all, and this game is ferociously ugly. Quite possibly the worst looking port in the whole video. I'm going to be pretty picky here as Shinobi is one of my favourite Sega games, but you can bet your bollocks to a barn dance that the Speccy version is far superior to this beige monstrosity. A lot of you marvelled at the Speccy port of Space Harrier, didn't you? How Keith Burkill managed to get such a playable version of the game into 48 kilobytes. It's quite an achievement. Unfortunately, most of the other ports fared pretty badly, including the Amiga one. It may look better graphically, but it just doesn't have the speed. Also, you control it using the mouse. Now you may have wondered if Space Harrier would work with a mouse, and I can tell you now that it absolutely does not. No matter how you set it up, it's way too freaking sensitive and you just end up crashing into everything. The Grand Slam port of Space Harrier 2 is a little better, and probably runs around the same as the Mega Drive version, but again, the mouse controls do ruin it. This game is not made for mouse control, at all. But you do at least get an option to play with a joystick for this one, mind you. Now as it goes, we're not quite done with Space Harrier yet. There's a little something else to look at, but we're going to save it for the selection of brand new ports and games for the end. I'll just say for now that it is by a long distance the most obscure entry in the series of Fantasy Zone related adventures. Passing Shot might have ended up in the about the same section, but I don't know, this one actually feels a lot worse. Passing Shot just isn't that good of a game to begin with, obviously. I bloody hate the top-down view of a tennis court and not being able to even see my frickin' player half the time, which automatically makes this a crap port. But the music also makes this dreadful. I mean, listen to this! Now, okay, I'm pretty sure this was some sort of bug related to whatever cracked version of the game that I played, and the game doesn't actually have this soundtrack, but it was still funny. Did your parents ever buy you a Casio keyboard in the hope that you'll be a natural at it and become a concert pianist at the age of 10 so they'll never have to work again? And then this is the sort of thing you start playing and they're all, "Ah, that's really good. Well done," while failing to hide the utterly crestfallen look on their faces? Well, that's what this bugged out soundtrack's like. Anyway, I digress. Whether this is the music for the game or not, and I am pretty sure it's not, it's still bloody rubbish. Lastly here, yeah, Turbo Out one. No surprises here. The specky port of this actually wasn't too bad, feeling like a bit of a make-up for the poor quality of the original on the computer. Unfortunately, the game's ports generally stunk pretty harshly on most other platforms, and the Amiga one is quite risible indeed. It's another highly choppy experience, much like the Amiga port of the original, only this game has considerably worse music. Can I once again say that it's better than Teartex's hideous Mega Drive version? I suppose I can, but not by much. And of course, the Amiga got a version of US Gold's original and rather odd Outrun Europa. Happily, the game is now in colour that wasn't strangely locked away behind a poke at the very last minute. And the game itself isn't too bad, even if it really doesn't belong in the series. Judging by the screenshots of what US Gold had been cooking before they got the rights to Turbo Out one, it would have been more similar to the original if this first version had been completed. Okay, that's just about the end of the bad stuff. I felt it was important to get through that first before progressing to the games that are decent. There's a solid 13 of them here in this section, and a few are very good ports indeed. So yes, happily this vid isn't all bloody dreadful drivel like Power Drift and what have you. Take Afterburner, for example. The Specky version was another very good Keith Burkill coded conversion, and so is the version on the Amiga. Well, depending on which version you play, anyway. Weirdly, there are two different versions of Afterburner, one released over here in Europe, and another in the States. Activision's version for Europe is definitely the inferior one. It's not bad, but it's definitely kneecapped due to running in a very tiny window, which is kind of silly for the Amiga to be honest, and feeling very bare despite having the speed and the music. Not the worst thing we've seen, but the American version is clearly superior. It might be a little bit slower, but it's full screen. It's got all the music too, and it's so much more busy. This just feels much more right. One thing that may be a pain these days is that the spacebar fires missiles rather than the joystick, but remember, back in the day you'd have the joystick on your desk, and you'd be controlling that with one hand, freeing the other one up for the keyboard. Get your brain out the gutter. It's definitely a better port anyway. Interestingly, the Activision port was done by Argonaut Games. Yes, the very same. This was their first project after breaking through with the Starglider titles, and it's not exactly the best game in their library. Needless to say, they would go on to better things. Much better things. Some of the worst ports on the Specky do happily have much better efforts available for the Amiga. Here, for example, is Bonanza Brothers. It was nearly unplayable on the Spectrum, but this is just so much better even beyond the appearance of colour. It's actually easy to control, and jumping is immediately obvious. The incredibly catchy music obviously helps too, and it also helps that there's more than just the one song. I always find this game to be generally a little underrated, and the Amiga's gone ahead and done it a good bit of justice. Alien Syndrome is also much better on the Amiga. I mean, it actually controls like the bloody arcade for a start, and it has the all-important creepy music which is kind of necessary for this title. It is very difficult, especially because you actually have to rescue every hostage on a stage rather than just a few of them, which is different to the arcade, but it does play nicely. And Wonder Boy in Monsterland is thankfully given a decent treatment, one that's happily bereft of weird and clunky Mario-esque momentum movement. It's not amazing or anything, but it would still be a perfectly okay version of the game for somebody who, I don't know, didn't have a Master System. Hot Rod wasn't exactly a leading light in any way, shape or form, but it's pretty decent on the whole. I mean, it is just a simple top-down racer where you upgrade your car between tracks, but at least there's scrolling this time. Yeah, there's probably no reason why you would play this when games like Nitro or Supercars are readily available, but it's not offensive. Don't worry, there will be actual good games coming soon. Games like SDI. Another quite underrated Sega arcade, and the Amiga version here does benefit from some nice mouse controls. They might take a teeny little bit of time to get used to, but they're actually not bad once you do, and the port does benefit from having some pretty decent music, for a change. And then there's World Championship Soccer. This was, of course, by far the worst port in the last video, a horrible mess crapped out by Canvas software that didn't even follow the basic rules of football. While the original game isn't good to begin with, the Amiga version is at the very least recognisable as football, and playable without having thoroughly stupid AI or the ability to just walk the bloody ball into the goal. Without Canvas's grubby hands getting onto it, you simply have a mediocre football game. Yay! Right, let's get down to some actually decent stuff. There are 6 Sega Arcade to Amiga ports specifically that, for my money, are pretty bloody good indeed, and well worth playing, and I'll run through them in reverse order of preference, a nice little countdown for the middle of the video. For a start, here's Super Monaco GP. Ugh, this is a much better racing game than anything we've seen so far. Look at how smooth it is, look at how the graphics are actually decent for a change. It even kind of looks like the arcade, even if it is in a window. This is viciously rock hard, seeing as it still follows the one life and you're screwed formula of the 8-bit versions, but as a port, it's decent, and does a good line in racing. A good racing line. Anyway, in at number 5, how about Shadow Dancer? Not a bad port on the Speccy, despite the multi-load, but the Amiga version is very solid indeed. Not an awful lot unique about it, just a very good workman-like port of a nice arcade that doesn't miss anything, and gives you a decent slice of arcade action. Very likeable. For number 4, I've gone with Dynamite Ducks. Yes, this is Core Design's effort, and yes, it does indeed come with a very rude and smutty introduction hidden in the code. But we've also got a mighty fine version of the pretty cute little beat-em-up with a whole load of weapons kicking around on the disc. It's a little bit slow, but still packed with enemies. One of those games that I think is quite overlooked in general, and this version here was definitely the best way for people to play it in the home. And at number 3, at last Creative Materials have a chance to shine. The Speccy port of Line of Fire wasn't too bad, although it was a little easy. This one here on the Amiga definitely feels more like the arcade. A proper rail shooter, played with the mouse, absolutely chock full of enemies. Now, sure, Line of Fire is basically a poor man's Operation Wolf. It is not a great game, but the quality of the port is good. Probably one of the best that Richard Applin ever did. It is fun if you like this sort of thing. Now, speaking of Richard Applin, he's got a funny developer message hidden in the code. He offers a little template for anyone busy creating a crack tro for the game, which I have recreated for you here to pause the video and enjoy a little. Even if some of his ports may be a little bit ropey, he certainly does have a good sense of humour. Okay, the top two. Both are excellent ports, and it was tricky to choose between them, but in the end I've given the runner-up spot to Golden Axe. The specky port of this was a noble effort, really. A little bit of a mess on the gameplay front, but they did try. The Amiga port absolutely does the game justice though. A great beat 'em up indeed that runs exactly as it should, with most of the music from the arcade and basically nothing missing. While the Mega Drive version is obviously the best 16-bit one, this is most certainly the best from the micros. And hell, seeing as there's not an awful lot of decent beat 'em ups on the Amiga, in all honesty, it's probably one of the best on the whole platform. And then the number one, well, of course, it's Super Hang-On. A belter of a port, one of the best arcade ones you'll find on the system, and a game where the mouse controls actually do work really frickin' well. In fact, there are some days where I might class this one as even better than the Mega Drive version. And it is indeed an ST port. The folks who had the Atari machine got much the same game too, only with an AY soundtrack. Excellent on every platform, this one. Well, except the C64. We don't talk about that version. But other than that, yep, the folks at Electric Dreams totally nailed this arcade. Top marks. Okay, we do have a couple of other games to look at, ones that weren't on the Specky, but were on the Amiga. I said earlier that we would return to Space Harrier's Fantasy Zone, and, well, here's Space Harrier Return to the Fantasy Zone, another game by Elite, another version of Space Harrier, meaning that it doesn't play very well at all. But what is it? Is it a port of something like Space Harrier 3D, or even a completely original game? Nope, it's the second half of the original Space Harrier. The first port on the Amiga only came with 9 of the original levels, way less even than the Spectrum version. Jeez, what a load of rubbish. It was seemingly made in around 1989, but it doesn't appear to have got a standalone release. It was only released in 1991 as part of a compilation called Finale that was one of the company's final releases for the Amiga. As such, this original Space Harrier game is very obscure and very rare, to the point where you usually won't even find it on any lists for the game. It's not exactly any good, but it is a bit of a curio for fans of the flying blonde-haired soldier and his journeys. The other two? Well, they're not all that much to speak of. We have kind of covered them before, but they're both ports of first-party Mega Drive titles. We have Tournament Golf, which is the Amiga version of Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, but without the license, and thoroughly botched. It has much the same graphics, but it's considerably awful in execution with a power bar system that, frankly, doesn't seem to work at all. None of the cheerful and catchy music either. Awful, awful game, this one. And then we have Last Battle. Yes, a port of Sega's rather cheesy side-scrolling beat-em-up, the one that was originally based on Fist of the North Star. This is an odd case. The quality of the port itself is actually decent, really. It runs smooth, it's full screen, it's got the music, it's got everything you could want from Last Battle. Of course, the original game is pretty bloody pants to begin with, but someone must have got a kick out of it to make such an accurate port. You can also play this one on the Commodore 64, as it goes. Now, I assume that specky versions of both this and Tournament Golf must have been planned at some stage, but clearly they never got released or anything, and they stuck to the Commodore platforms. Both of these releases, as well as World Championship Soccer, are obscure. You won't find much in the way of reviews or coverage for any of them, but for the sake of completion, they ought to be here. Now, just to finish things off, it could be considered curious as to why, just like the ZX Spectrum, these ports completely stopped around early 1992. There was an obvious reason as to why they'd stop on the Spectrum. After all, the platform was coming to an end, but the Amiga had a good couple of years left at this point. However, once again, G-Loc was the last Sega arcade port here. Now, the reason itself isn't actually that hard to figure out, but it does kind of relate to the possibility that a certain blue hedgehog might have made his way to the computers. Yes, there was a fleeting moment in time when Sonic the Hedgehog was scheduled to make his way to micros, to the Amiga, ST, C64, and possibly even the ZX Spectrum. It was mentioned in a couple of magazines, most notably CVG, and there's even a couple of screenshots. Very curious. These ports would have been handled, as you might have guessed, by US Gold. They were pretty much the only ones who were doing the Sega ports by 1991, after all, and you can expect that studios under their purview, such as Tiertex, would have gotten involved in these games, which were apparently planned to be released in the summer of 1992. Why did this not happen then? Why didn't we see the blue bullet on computers? Well, again, the reason isn't that hard to figure out, really. You might think it odd that we saw actual Mega Drive games on the Amiga and the like to begin with, in much the same way that it's odd to see a few Sega games make it to the NES or the PC Engine. It doesn't seem like the best idea to give games over to be ported to your competition, does it? And Sega eventually figured that one out. While there was certainly an agreement in place at one stage for Sonic to come to computers, the immediate huge success of the title, obviously being the game that really sent the Mega Drive into the stratosphere, made Sega cancel that agreement pretty bloody quickly, and it would seem that they changed tack everywhere else. Arcade ports and the like for Sega games would be on the Mega Drive only from that point. Which, well, it certainly makes a great deal more sense. How far along was the development of these ports before they all got cancelled? Probably not very far at all. Certainly no code has ever been leaked, and all that exists are those magazine screenshots. It is quite possible, and indeed probably likely, that those screenshots were simply mock-ups, meaning that there's nothing really out there to find. Who knows? For now, all we have of Sonic on the Amiga, at least from the time, is his rather strange and totally unofficial cameo in The Adventures of Quick and Silver, a game anonymously made by Kiko and released on the cover of the obscure and short-lived Amiga Fun magazine, about a month or so before the official release of Sonic on the Mega Drive. Yes, the microcomputer scene, it was a strange place indeed. And with that, well, we're about done here. That's a quick look at Sega's exploits on the Amiga, as executed through the likes of US Gold, Elite, and Activision. If there's interest in a look at how the C64 handled things, well, I'm sure I'll end up examining those too. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will say, as ever, bye for now. Ghosts and Goblins and Ghouls and Ghosts. What a lovely pair. Two fabulous games from Capcom that may be tricky, but are certainly worth taking on. I've already done a vid all about both of these titles, but unfortunately this one's taken us down a bit of a darker path. You may well know, if you watch my live streams, that I've put myself through a wheel filled with nothing but Amiga Euro platformers. There were over 400 games on the damned thing, and while I did pull myself together to play all the games on there over the course of a few months, I probably won't ever be quite the same. Quite a few of these games were heavily inspired by Capcom's titles, and so, seeing as it is October, I thought it would be a good idea to cover a bunch of these G&G clones in a video. I've got 7 games here, and most of them are pretty bad. Indeed, a couple of them are considered amongst the worst titles ever released for the Amiga, and I can assure you that's quite the achievement. But there is some intrigue here, and there may possibly even be a good game to come from all of these titles. Possibly, you never know. So let's not waste any more time. Here's 7 Amiga games that well and truly answer that age-old plea of, "Mum, can I have Ghosts and Goblins?" with, "We have Ghosts and Goblins at home." Now, before we get into these, we should have a quick little benchmark and see what the Amiga conversions of Ghosts and Goblins and Ghouls and Ghosts are actually like, just so we all know what we're up against. Elite's Ghosts and Goblins is much more famous as an 8-bit conversion. It was originally released for the likes of the Speccy and C64 in 1986, but it did eventually make its way to the Amiga and Atari ST in 1990. So how does this one fare? This one's decent, as it goes. The scrolling is a little bit iffy, but it does feel close to the arcade when it comes to music and graphics. The most irritating thing here is that you can't jump and shoot backwards, which can be awkward, especially when dealing with arenas, but on the whole, I don't mind this one too much. It's certainly better than US Gold and Software Creations' Ghouls and Ghosts, which oddly came out a few months before Elite's 16-bit version of the original. This is awful. The movement is horrendously choppy, nothing really looks right, the controls are worse even if you can jump and shoot backwards. It's just rubbish. The only plus point is that, as always, Tim Follin's music is different, creative, and thoroughly excellent. Software Creations did actually do some pretty good Ghouls and Ghosts conversions for the 8-bits, especially the Spectrum, but this Amiga one, yeah, this isn't it. Anyway, now that we've seen what the real thing's like on the Amiga, let's go and have a look at some clones. I suppose a good place to start would be with one of the more famous G&G inspired games out there. This is Elite's Beyond the Ice Palace from 1988. Following the success of their 8-bit conversion of Ghosts and Goblins, Elite came up with this title that has an odd little story behind it. It's the one that was originally supposed to be a Thundercats game but got delayed, so Elite picked up a nearly finished and not very good title called Samurai Dawn from FTL and switched that up to Thundercats, eventually releasing this as an original. Some have fond memories of this one on various platforms, mostly the 8-bits. It reviewed pretty well back then. But this is one game where the more I play it, frankly the more I hate it. It is so frustrating. The slightest chance of progress usually depends on having a specific weapon to hand, you have to go through certain routes to get them, and while you do have a screen clearing spirit at your disposal, even that's not always dependable. You die in one hit, and while you get 8 lives, trust me, you will burn through them fast. Even if this is actually a pretty short game indeed with only a couple of levels, it's basically a load of bashing your head against the wall, trying to find the right path or really just getting lucky. The major saving grace is David Whittaker's wonderful music. However, here on the Amiga, even that's ruined by the addition of awful sound effects. When one enemy in particular appears, my god, it's not often that I have to reach for a mute button, but that's certainly going to do it. Beyond the Ice Palace, I feel, is a game that got popular simply because of there not being too many other arcade-style games like it on the computers at the time. While it is certainly better on the 8-bits, particularly C64 and Amstrad, than it is on the bloody Amiga, which actually might be one of the worst versions, this is just completely unfun for me. Maybe a lot of people just remember that awesome music and forget about the actual game. Still, it is worth noting that the old Ice Palace is getting a revival. Yes, Beyond the Ice Palace 2 is going to be coming soon to Steam and all modern consoles. It looks like it's going to be a cool Metroidvania from the trailer, and while David Whittaker hasn't returned, Alistair Brimble's going to be on the tunes for this one. The return of the Ice Palace is a surprising one to be sure, but it looks like it's going to be a welcome one. I mean, I'm sure it'll be better than trying to play the original game again at any rate. Belial might also be one of the better known G&G clones, and it's certainly one of the most disliked. This 1989 title comes from a land down under, published by Entertainment and Computer Products, or ECP, and developed by Sector Software, who did this and one other game called Invasion. This is number 6 on Lemon Amiga's list of the worst MIGI games of all time, and it's easy to see why. What we have here in this G&G ripoff is an already shirtless Arthur who dies in one hit, funnily enough it's the zombies that take multiple ones, who has no weapon except some white dots that could be salt or could be something else, and there's a one projectile on the screen limit. With Arthur being in such a state here, I'm going to assume that this man is not a kin, but instead is a bogan who's just been knocked out in a massive brawl at the Bathurst 1000, and this is the fever dream that his concussed brain is experiencing. Perhaps that explains why, of all things, this game's soundtrack is a cover of Das Model by Kraftwerk. Most people's experience of Belial will not go past the first level. It takes about 30 seconds for hordes of jumping pumpkins to come at you. These pumpkins are relentless, they're hard to hit, they will track your position, and they will follow you to the ends of the earth. These pumpkins will almost certainly be the death of you, and you only get 3 lives, so get ready to see the first part of level 1 again and again until you shut the thing off. As we will see shortly, this first part of the level is purposefully ridiculously brutal. If you manage to get past the pumpkins, you meet a boss that's essentially a simplified version of G&G's Red Arima. I, however, could not get this far without cheating. There is thankfully a cheat mode that turns off the collision detection, although don't turn this on immediately because otherwise you'll go through the moving platform at the beginning, which is, as it turns out, the only moving platform in the whole game. With this, we can see the rest of the game, all 3 rather short levels of it. The second and third levels don't appear to be as challenging as the first. You fight 2 Arimas at the end of level 2, 3 of them at level 3, and then the game's over. Little bit of text, and that's your lot. Well done. If you were somehow able to master Belial and get through the nightmarish beginning, you can easily beat it in less than 5 minutes. Would such effort be worth it? Possibly for charity, but I think submerging myself in a bath of baked beans for 24 hours would be much more palatable. In the end, this is a pretty horrid little G&G clone in every department. What with the ripped off music, 8-bit graphics, and particularly the atrocious gameplay and unfair difficulty, it's easy to see why it has such a low rating of 1.61 on Lemon Amiga. There is a little hidden message in the code from Robert Richardson, one of the 2 people who made the game, imploring crackers to not distribute this title in Australia. He wasn't bothered about anywhere else, but spreading Belial in Oz could severely damage the already tiny Aussie software market. Spreading Belial sounds like something that'd get you in trouble with the famously strict border security. Now I'm not sure how effective his entreaties were, although Belial is certainly an infamous title in the Amiga community. So, perhaps it worked out. This Antipodean take on G&G is certainly fearsome, but is it the worst of them? Well, we've got a few more to get through first. The Sword and the Rose takes us to the land of Codemasters, where apparently the fun starts here. However, having tried to play this a few times, I'm not really convinced that it does. The 8-bit folks amongst you may recognise this game under a different name. On the likes of the Spectrum and C64, this was called Prince Clumsy. I had this on the Specky back in the day and I actually remember liking it, but this 16-bit version? Nah, it's no good at all. What we have here is a flick-screen G&G-esque game, one where the enemies all appear at random and there is a bit more exploration involved. The whole game is essentially one big level, but you have to find a key in each section in order to unlock a portcullis and move on to the next one. It is really quite clunky, it must be said. You can't crouch at all, which can make a lot of the enemies annoying. Honestly, in a lot of instances it's best just to try and run to the next screen as fast as you can. The flick screen can also prove incredibly cheap, especially when it's paired with such speedy movement. When you're trying to fall down into the next screen, it can be very easy to completely miss a platform that you're supposed to land on and fall into a death pit, especially because collision detection on these platforms is pretty bad to begin with. Generally, The Sword and the Rose is a rather irritating experience indeed. Cheap and nasty with some really quite terrible jumping mechanics, a game that really shouldn't have been flick screen, and a hopeless hero who struggles to deal with any of the rather generic enemies on show. Still, it's nowhere near the level of something like Belial, that's obvious. Hell, I might just put it over the Amiga version of Ghouls and Ghosts, even though that's not saying a lot. For a start, we do have some pretty decent game music thanks to the ever-dependable Alistair Brimble. That's definitely the best thing on show here, and this game is also a budget title. It may not be great, or even remotely good, but at least it was a measly $4.99 in the shops. One other thing, I'm not totally sure why they changed the name of the game for the 16-bit versions, as the game's no different aside from that. There is an ancient RKO film with the same name and a similar oldie England setting, but that's clearly unrelated. Anyway, if you're going to play this, well, go and fire up Prince Clumsy on either the Spectrum or C64, have a perfectly acceptable time with it, and forget entirely about this thoroughly inferior 16-bit version. Sticking with Codemasters, here's a slightly later game from them, The Quest of Agravain from 1992. This is intriguing in that it's not just a takeoff of Ghosts and Goblins, it's also a takeoff of Rainbow Islands. You get two for the price of one here, a medieval themed game where various spirits, spiders, demons and wizards are trying to stop you, a brave knight of the realm, from saving the kingdom. Just as in Rainbow Islands, the stages are vertical. However, you do have a couple of different weapons that you can pick up, and just as in G&G, you can take a couple of hits. You'll know you're down to your last hit point when your suit of armour falls off. Is this any better than The Sword and the Rose? I'd say that they're about the same in the end. Both of them are basically bad, but they're definitely not the worst games in this video. In fact, they're honestly the closest that we're going to get to something that's at least okay. You can play this, even if you're not going to have all that fun a time. Still, we do essentially have a compound fracture of a title here that generally combines several of the lamest things that you're likely to see in either a Ghosts and Goblins clone or a Rainbow Islands clone. Scrolling that's dodgy, jumps that are just that little bit too big and often result in you bumping your head on an enemy that's just appeared, a whole load of occasional bullshit where it feels like every damn thing's going to stop you from making progress and there's little you can do about it, all that sort of thing. Quest of Agravain is neither the worst G&G ripoff, nor is it the worst Rainbow Islands ripoff. Far from it, in fact. But it's still certainly not something I'd suggest ever playing more than once out of sheer curiosity. Hell, go play Cody's Captain Dynamo if you want a better Rainbow Islands-esque vertical platformer. That's much more bearable. Carver is unfortunately not a game about the escapades of Jim Carver from The Bill, everyone's favourite occasionally down and out detective turned plodder. The startup for this 1991 game of German origin seems kind of promising and a little weird, especially when the face of the game's hero is suddenly replaced by that of presumably the lead coder. But then the game itself, oh no. We have a quite pitiful take on the G&G formula where our tiny and improperly dressed hero cannot even throw weapons about. Instead he opts to punch enemies and his punches... Well, I had to think about what his punch reminded me of, but I did ultimately figure that out.
Do it! You know, you hard bastard!
You can also pick up weapons which you access with the function keys that can be a bit more powerful, but don't do an awful lot to increase Carver's range, so he's still likely to get hit by damn near any of the tiny critters that are milling about. Our poor muscle-bound hero really isn't well equipped to deal with birds, or flies, or spiders, or frankly anything at all. The music isn't too bad at least, but I wasn't able to get all that far on this game. I rather hopelessly stumbled forward, wrestling with jumping that's also annoyingly floaty and hard to control, just to really ram the awfulness home, before dying not all that far away from where I started. It is another quite rubbish game indeed, although it is at least another budget one. I'm not exactly sure how many Deutschmarks this game would have cost back in the day, but thankfully it wasn't full price. Still, this is quite a dreadful and rightly very obscure little game that I'd have never found out about if it wasn't for this damned wheel. Now, this next one isn't strictly a Ghosts and Goblins ripoff, but it's certainly close, and it's also an amusingly obscure and weird subject. This game here is Caverns of Pala, and it dips our toe into the work of an Australian man named Kyle Hodgetts, a rather interesting fellow who made various computer games and arcade games back in the late 80s and early 90s that are even more direct rip-offs of other titles than the games that we've seen, to the point of using the same sprites, even. This is more of a rip-off of Rygar than it is of Ghosts and Goblins, but a lot of the sprites here are also taken from Capcom's Black Tiger, including the main hero, along with others from Rygar, and they're all thrown into a game that's very bad indeed. One funny thing about these Kyle Hodgetts games is that usually your hero falls down onto the stage whenever he loses a life, so if you position that screen just right and get a gap into the correct place, you can easily trigger a death loop. That sort of thing's just lovely, although not so much if you were to trigger it by accident. Caverns of Pala is but one of a series of Amiga games by Kyle Hodgetts that are minor variations on this theme. We also have the likes of Evil Dawn, Aztec Warrior, and Kin of the Barbarians, all of which appear to take Rygar as their main inspiration, and then take other sprites from all over the shop. There's even more intrigue to be had when looking at some of the arcade games he's created. Just look at Dark Tower here, a Bubble Bobble-esque spooky game that takes sprites and graphics from Ghosts and Goblins, Rygar, Black Tiger and Snow Brothers, uses Double Dragon hardware and takes the music and sound effects from that game, and for all that is actually a rather entertainingly silly title. Indeed, there's quite a story behind the man in general. Computer games are but one part of it, and he's often been featured on Australian news for various reasons. Whether they be of a more investigative nature, something that resulted in him attempting to sue Nine Network for $2.5 billion in 2017, or treating atherosclerosis via the administration of cyclodextrins. I'm not kidding. The man has certainly had a storied career, full of twists and turns, and these bad old games only really scratch the surface. You would certainly want to have a chat with the guy, that's for sure. Now, finally, when we're talking about bad takes on the Capcom G&G formula, a lot of Amiga fans would say that it is pretty hard to beat Belial, one of the games that we saw earlier on in this vid. However, there is one other game that can truly contend with that title's pure misery, and it is also a perfect one for this spooky season. Say hello to Nightwalk. Hailing from 1989, Nightwalk may possibly be the worst assemblage of code ever published by alternative software, and I hardly need to remind you that these guys also released Count Duckula 2 and BMX Ninja. If you remember old Stuart Ashen's videos about terrible old games you've probably never heard of, you may have heard of Nightwalk through his take on it, and he certainly wasn't kidding. This may be the slowest game on the Amiga, or indeed on the Atari ST where it originally spawned on, and I'd include strategy games in that one. You play as this clunky Arnie-esque hero, at least he looks kinda similar from the side until you get to have a look at his hilarious face, and you inch forward dealing with zombies, bats, and other assorted creatures of the night with your bow and arrow. This bow is quite amazing. Not being able to move while using a bow isn't unusual, but you actually can't even move while the arrow is still on the screen. You're simply there, paralysed, until it leaves the area of combat. Naturally, enemies will kill you if you get too close. Hell, they may even kill you as they're dying if they get too far inside. And obviously, you only get 3 lives and no continues. Not that you would want to continue playing this game. We don't have a cover of Das Model on the soundtrack, but we do have some pretty naff music. And the graphics? I scarcely need to say anything. Undoubtedly, this title is a true horror indeed. The Lemon Amiga community have bestowed a score of 1.75 on this title, enough for it to be in the site's bottom 20 of Amiga games. But is it worse than Belial? Oh, gee. Honestly, I don't know. It's very close. Both of them are titles that quite frankly get absolutely nothing right. Broken in the extreme. I think though, based on the graphics being a little bit brighter, and the silly Kraftwerk soundtrack being that little bit more amusing, If I were to choose one of these games to play, if there were absolutely no other alternatives, I think I'd have to go with Belial. Although frankly I'd rather just give up gaming entirely than play either of them ever again. And well, that does it for this October video, one with a theme that's ever so slightly tangential to All Hallows Eve. I wondered if we would find something good, or at least okay here, but I think we've managed to come up short on that front. But this is the result of doing that big old Amiga wheel. I now have a whole load of generally not very good Amiga obscura that I've experienced that will gradually need highlighting as and when I am physically and mentally ready to do so. This, well, I'm afraid it's only the beginning. The next video will hopefully involve something brighter, and definitely better, but until that time comes to pass, bye for now. Amiga Power. Yes, it's time for a video that centres around the greatest Amiga magazine of them all. Hell, one of the best computer game mags that there's ever been. Always funny, always creative, and always honest. Uncompromisingly so, even. While a lot of other magazines were often a bit nicer when it came to certain titles, for various reasons, Amiga Power didn't exactly hesitate to call a bad game exactly what it was. Indeed, just the simple act of them using the entirety of a 100% review scale to rate a game was enough to annoy quite a lot of publishers. They wouldn't just give a terrible game a 65% score and leave it at that. But even if the list of industry folk that they fell out with may have been long, and even if some publishers may well have wanted future publishing to clip their wins a bit, they certainly did have a dedicated audience. That honesty was highly appreciated, and one of the reasons why it's such a well-remembered magazine today. They cared pretty deeply about the Amiga and championed the best that it had to offer, even as they admittedly became more and more jaded in their later years due to the computer's painful death spiral. By the time that the magazine ended on its 65th issue in September of 1996, geez, the poor computer was in quite a shocking state, and a lot of the people left releasing games were like buzzards picking at a corpse, releasing shockingly low quality games to an increasingly desperate user base. Hell, the Amiga's in a much, much better state commercially right now in 2024 than it was back then. So, what are we doing here? We're looking at some of those low quality bits of code, that's for sure. I have a list of the worst rated games in the history of Amiga Power, all the games that they deemed worthy of a score of 10% or less. For most magazines, a score in the single digits was pretty damn rare. When I look at the archives of other publications thanks to the almighty Amiga magazine rack, I see very few times it happened. Even Amiga Format, AP's sister magazine, only did it 8 times, and that's over double the amount of total issues that Amiga Power had. Amiga Power? Well, they did it 38 times. If something was terrible, they damn well wanted you to know. We're going to be looking at these 38 games, and they make for an interesting selection. Some of these titles are obvious all-time turkeys, some of them are more obscure. A whole bunch of them are older games that got a kick-in on a budget re-release. We have examples of some pretty nasty gaming practices, a bunch of licensed guff, and, well, a few entries that may surprise you, and perhaps didn't deserve such low marks. We shall see. We'll be going down in reverse order, starting with the 10% titles and finishing all the way down at 1%. And I'm happy to have Matthew Smith, current day Amiga journalist and maker of the excellent Amiga Power album With Attitude, lending his voice to a couple of the magazine's most memorable put-downs. Let's get on with it. Here's something familiar to kick things off. Red Heat. This hit squad re-release got a princely 10% in October of 1991. A certain Stuart Campbell said that in the spirit of the game's tagline, saying that it was the hottest film tie-in to date, he chucked it into a bin and set it on fire. Having played this utterly weird pile of dung many times, I can't exactly disagree. It's the game with a rather ridiculous looking letterbox effect where a naked Arnie walks slowly forward, dodging snowballs and punching out endless John Rambos. The game where James Belushi greets you before each stage with the worst talking animation ever. He's the second coming of Gabbo. I mean, it's horrendous. It is, at the very least, one of the funniest of all the dreadful licensed games out there. It's such a baffling title that all you can really do is laugh at it. Not exactly Ocean's finest work. 10% low? Oh, yeah, definitely. Up next is Ruffian, a game released by Grand Slam in 1995. It got savaged in AP's 50th issue, given all of 10%. According to Jonathan Nash, it's a game that yells, "Hey, look at me, I'm grossly substandard." The title itself is a rather simple jungle-themed platformer where you run and jump around, saving various pixies that are trapped up the trees by hocking nuts at them. So far so Amiga then. The very European platformer stylings of this game slap you round the chops as soon as you boot it up. Honestly though, the presence of a game like Ruffian here probably smacks more of how clearly jaded and fed up the magazine was in its later years. Is this game particularly terrible? Well, not really. It moves smoothly and all that, doesn't control terribly so long as you factor in the usual up to jump that, if we're all honest, can be easily circumvented nowadays. Is it painfully generic? Well, yes. There's a time when games like Ruffian were 10 a penny, but it's not exactly badly made and even has some half-decent animation going for it. Compared to Red Heat, it's absolutely bloody amazing. It gets a poor review, but for me certainly not enough to justify a 10% score. This is closer to a 40% game. Not recommended, but not all out dreadful. Now, you would hope that the free 10% games would give us a pretty light beginning, but next we have an arcade port that throws us right in at the deep end. Total Carnage, which was brought to the Amiga by Ice Software, who are perhaps most famous for their diabolical Akira tie-in game. However, a score of 16% meant Akira didn't make it to this vid. However, this one did. AP gave it 10% in May of 1994, with Stuart Campbell proclaiming that any similarity between this and the arcade game was purely coincidental. There's a weird nostalgia to this one for me, mind. This was actually one of the pack-in games in the A1200 I got for Christmas that year, the Computer Combat set, alongside Zool 2 and Brian the Lion. But yes, as far as Amiga pack-in titles go, Total Carnage could easily give Dangerous Streets, which we will be seeing later, a run for its money. This is an absolutely shocking conversion, one of the worst attempts at an arena shooter ever. It's missing a hell of a lot, with so many of the enemies from the arcade not present, a lot of the humour stripped out, absolutely no music and minimal sound effects. And what's here is shocking. One of the most hilarious things about the game is that even when you kill enemies, they can still kill you. Their blood splatter is still a hitbox coming forward at you, meaning that you can't even really run through them with something like a flamethrower because you'll just end up dying, and there are no continues. Instead, you're best off standing and picking them off as they largely come at you single file in a game that's appallingly slow, especially considering that it came out in frickin' 1994. It goes without saying that Total Carnage belongs on this list. It is an all-time turkey of an arcade port. We move into single figures with an entry that might well surprise some folk. Leisure Suit Larry 3, another budget re-release. A lot of people have fond memories of old Larry Laffer's adventures, but I always remember them being utterly scorched in UK mags. Seriously, they hated them. This review from AP40 is a good example. Jonathan Nash had this to say of it.
Leisure Suit Larry and its sequels perpetuate the myth that PCs are not used by game-playing folk who want to network doom, but by emotionally restricted, middle-aged, rapidly failing businessmen under doctor's orders not to drink, who want clumsy puerility masquerading as dangerous fun.
So yeah, ouch. To be honest, I don't recall a lot of Sierra's old adventures getting good reviews, certainly not from Amiga Power. King's Quest generally did okay by them, but that's about it. Is Mr. Laffer here deserving of 9%? Well, I certainly wouldn't say so. Playing it can be a bit annoying in that typical Sierra way, the hybrid of clicking around with dodgy pathfinding and entering text commands. But yeah, it's just a Leisure Suit Larry game. There's certainly plenty of games out there that are far worse, but the knives really came out over here for everyone's favourite sophisticated single swinger. I can only suggest, flat out, that the games were far too offensively American for our British critics. You'll find that quite a lot of games in this video are re-releases of some sort, and that's the case with this next one, Le Fétiche Maya, or simply Maya, as Amiga Power called it. In a short review, Jonathan Nash said that this was stunningly boring and featured little more than bartering your icons for other icons, giving it 9%. This game is indeed not the most gripping, but I wouldn't give it 9. It's a simple enough adventure type game from French game makers Silmarils, where you play as some explorer and you're going around nicking ancient Mayan artifacts because, well, it's your birthright, I suppose. Screw these people and their history because it's going to bring you lots of fame and money. It's bland, but nowhere near as badly made as most of the other games we're going to see, and the driving sequences are a little more engaging. I'd say it's a 30 to 40% game. What's more interesting to mention is that this is the first of many re-releases we'll be seeing from a budget publisher called Prism Leisure Corporation, a name you may also know from cheap videos, CDs and DVDs. Prism were the budget end of budget. A lot of their Amiga titles came out for Amiga free quid, lower than the usual Amiga budget range of between £5 and £10. Or they released compilations like Hits for 6, which is where this game comes from. £26, but with 6 games, usually one quite well-known big-ticket item, another game that's a bit lesser known, and the rest being pretty obscure. While you may well find the odd bargain in the Prism library, we are going to be seeing quite a lot of Prism budget re-releases in this video purely thanks to how prolific they were. Here's another familiar re-release, Street Fighter. This got 9% from Stuart Campbell in AP4. For the low sum of £8, you could get a beat-em-up that was appalling beyond belief, one that men with crowbars apparently had to force the reviewer to play more than once. This is a conversion that might have had something for people back in 1989, but yeah, even by 1991 it was already showing its age. It's quite comically simple. Almost all of the fights can just be won by jumping around and performing the weird spinny crouch kick thing, seeing as basically all the enemies fight the same. It's not worth trying to do special moves, which is just as well because for the most part there aren't any. So yes, the usual qualities of the Tiertex US Gold duo shine through here, I'm afraid to say. It is a quite awful port, and I would say 9% is pretty fair. I suppose that one consolation is that Amiga Power never properly reviewed Human Killing Machine, although they did give it a little retrospective column once where they naturally trashed it severely, so I am pretty sure I would be playing that one again if they'd had the chance to give that game a proper look over. We're bringing the heat up by another degree now and going into the 8% games. However, this next title is kind of an odd one to have here, but obviously it counts. Jason Kinsley's Blade Warrior, on its own, actually got 2 perfectly okay scores in the 70s in previous AP reviews. However, when Jonathan Nash encountered it as part of another Prism Hits for 6 compilation in 1994, he hated the game and gave it 8%, calling it gimmicky and stupendously dull. I can't say I agree with this one at all. This is an engaging and quite different side-scroller with lots of atmosphere and a really cracking silhouette effect on everything, something that you certainly didn't see much at all back in 1991. Not brilliant as a game, but it's appreciated. Jonathan Nash appears to have been tasked with critiquing 3 of these Hits for 6 compilations for the same issue of AP, and there's a lot of pretty bad games on them, so perhaps that contributes to the rather high level of scorn shown in this copy. In any case though, this definitely isn't an 8% game, by any stretch of the imagination. This next game is much more fitting. It's Dennis. The knives were already going to be out for this one. It's Ocean's licensed title for the kids film that replaces much-loved Beano comic character Dennis the Menace with some irritating American kid, and it's not helped by them offering up a very piss-poor platformer. Stuart Campbell had this to say in his 8% review.
Useless graphics, useless collision detection, useless design, useless sound, useless gameplay, useless everything. It's useless.
This game, whether it's here on the Amiga or the SNES, is indeed just utterly flat. A very unappealing Euro platformer where you aimlessly go around the stages in search of 4 big Dennis coins, with damn near every Euro platform cliché represented. Bouncing enemies, gaps that don't look like gaps, the most mundane objects becoming absolutely lethal. Oh, they're all here, and they're all annoying. 8% certainly isn't far off the mark with this game. There may well be worse platformers than this one, and we will be seeing a couple of them, but even if Dennis isn't necessarily technically the worst thing ever, everything about it is thoroughly dislikable, and it's way below the standards that Ocean set with a lot of their other 16-bit platform titles. There's quite the phenomenal gap in quality between this absolute guff and the likes of Mr. Nuts, Lethal Weapon and The Addams Family. Even the music is an unrelenting load of dreariness. Just absolutely not. Right, you want more licensed gaming? Well, here's something that's stupidly obscure, and rightly so, but also funny. Fantasy Manager. A game originally released by Anco, but then stuck out on budget by Hit Squad mere months after its initial arrival, this game has a license from Fantasy Football League. You know, the classic TV show. Baddiel, Skinner, Stato, Jeff Assel, Phoenix from the Flames, Pele was shit. All that lot, though you'd scarcely know it. The 8% November 95 review from Paul Mellerick calls it an obscenely basic cash-in only for seriously anal management players and closet statos. And, yeah, it's utterly awful. You wouldn't even know this was based on the TV show if it wasn't for the one single-screen capture of Baddiel and Skinner in the main menu, as zero humour has been imported into the game from the show. Other than that, you buy players for your team in typical fantasy football fashion, and then, well, just go through the matches against opposing teams. The whole thing consists of nothing but pressing enter, so you could easily use one of those dippy bird toys to play it, just as Homer Simpson would. You even have to press enter through the opponent's matches just to skip the damn things. I'm not sure this game even really gets how fantasy football works. There's no real graphics beyond a bit of fancy scoreboard work that Mr. Biffo may well have been proud of, and it's an absolutely pointless piece of code. Why on earth you would spend any money to play fantasy football with your friends on the computer when you can just play it with your friends using the bloody newspaper and actual real friggin' results is beyond me. Anyway, here's something funny, and also very late death of Amiga-ish. This game was originally released in around March of 95 and sold for 20 quid. This re-release came out through Hit Squad, with the price cut in half to a tenner, in November of 1995. The very next month, no word of a lie, the full game was given away on the front of one of the zombie editions of The One Amiga magazine by Maverick. You know, the ones that proclaimed Hollywood Hustler to be the greatest game ever made. In the immortal words of Dr. Stuart Ashen, a fitting punishment. You know, I think that Matt Bealby, then editor of Amiga Power, must have been having a bit of a giggle when it came to this next game. Secret of the Silver Blades, released on the Amiga in October of 1991. This is an AD&D gold box RPG from Strategic Simulations Inc., certainly makers of some of the driest games I can think of, released by US Gold. Already it's not exactly AP's wheelhouse, if we're being honest. And who gets assigned the job of reviewing this game? Stuart bloody Campbell. Shockingly enough, Campbell absolutely hated the game and gave it 8%. He's sorry if any D&D fanatics think he didn't spend enough of his time on the game, but his life's too short to waste any more of it on this, and actually he's not sorry at all. Now, I'm not even going to pretend that I'm able to cast any personal judgment on Secret of the Silver Blades in this short blurb. It's exactly the sort of D&D RPG you would expect from SSI, and it's not something I'm hugely experienced with, nor is it really my cup of tea. It is a fair few people's cup of tea though. Of the games in this video that are here on their original release, as opposed to a budget reissue, it's definitely one of the best performing titles both critically and commercially, part of a popular series. Just not here in Amiga Power. You've got to laugh at the choice of reviewer here though. I mean, it's like knowingly serving up foie gras to a passionate vegan. You shouldn't be surprised if the dish ends up smashed against the bloody wall. World Cricket is the third game on this countdown to come from a Prism Hits for 6 compilation. Jeez, and we've only just started. This here is a budget cricket management sim by Zeppelin, and there's not a lot to it. The 8% score from Jonathan Nash here says it's nothing but flash icons and tedious figures. The original review wasn't exactly complimentary either, widely saying that there is nothing to the game. You can't do an awful lot here, frankly. Your only real job as a cricket manager is to select the batsmen and bowlers, and then just watch as the scoreboard goes up. Occasionally you get highlights if a boundary is hit, or if a batsman gets out, and yeah, that's it really. The only other strategy perhaps is deciding when to declare. So yes, this is quite an empty game indeed. You'd have thought there could be some other options when it comes to at least determining how your team plays, but there's nothing at all. Cricket management in list form is pretty dire, essentially nothing more than watching some numbers go up, and it deserves the score that it got. We're taking one step more and going into the 7% titles, although again we've got another one that may be a bit controversial. Eye of Horus is a game by Denton Designs, a much loved studio back in the mid-80s, although this is one of their later titles. This one generally received okay reviews back when it originally came out in 1989, but Amiga Power encountered it on a November 1991 release, and it's Stuart Campbell reviewing it. Thusly, it gets scorched. Campbell proclaimed it utter rubbish that made the Amiga look like the C64 on a bad day, and it was given a mere 7%. This is one I really disagree with, to be honest. This is a very 8-bit micro-style arcade adventure, one that is, as mentioned in the review, quite similar to Denton's older Gift from the Gods, and for what it is, it's fine. Is it a bit old-fashioned by 91 standards? Yes, certainly. I actually think it feels more like an updated Alchemist with switching from Horus's human form to the Falcon, and that game was ancient even in 1991. But the mechanics themselves are sound for the genre, the music's okay, and considering that this budget re-release from Prism only priced the game at a measly £3, I think this should have got a fairer shake. I'd have given it around 50%, still using the full range of the percentage scale as AP did. We're back to the world of arcade ports, and next up we've got G-Loc R360. Sega and US Gold are coming in for a kick-in thanks to Les Ellis, who, in October 1992, gave the game 7% and said it was the worst piece of software he'd come across in his life, and that if you bought this, you needed your head kicking. I mean, I can't say I'd want to kick anyone's head in over buying this. Unless it was my bald alcoholic flatmate and they'd just spent our last £26 on this game instead of a slap-up grill for 2, I suppose. But yes, this is a very bad conversion. It's just so plain. But then so was the arcade itself, seeing as if you took away the ultra fancy R360 machine, it was basically just a stripped out version of Afterburner. I always found it funny that these home ports made sure to include R360 in the title, mind, as if playing this on the Amiga would bear any relation to playing this in an R360 cabinet, unless you were doing it in the middle of an earthquake or something. I don't know if this is as bad as a score of 7%, but it ain't that far away. Hilariously, Jonathan Nash's reviews of Prism's hits for 6 comps account for quite a few games in this list. Next up is Graham Souness Soccer Manager, a Zeppelin game originally from 1992 which got 7% and was called Holy Gruesome. This is similar to World Cricket in that it's a very basic management game. You have little control over much except who's playing, and there's not even any tactics to be found. This is especially bad considering that the Amiga was basically the home of football management titles. There were a lot of them, and this is definitely at the bottom of the league. Even for a budget game, it's utterly threadbare. To be honest, it feels an awful lot like the age-old Football Manager on the ZX Spectrum, and as Jonathan Nash says in his short review, the terrible highlights in this game aren't even as good as the ones in that game, which came out all the way back in 1982. So yeah, a cheap Football Manager knockoff with no depth, bad highlights, and a complete absence of the manly face of Kevin Toms? It deserves the terrible rating it got. Probably not the worst title with Graham Souness's name on it, mind. For completion's sake, Vector Soccer, one of the slowest and worst playing football games ever, actually got 32% when reviewed in AP, so we won't see it here. Right, standards are really starting to fall off a cliff. It's time for the 6% games, and just to demonstrate that, Battletoads is up next. And, oh lord. The mark of 6% comes from a very short review of the CD32 version, which was exactly the same as the A1200, only £5 more. The regular version, reviewed in October 94, got 9%, so it would have still been in this video, and rightly so. Rich Pelly says that AP's suspicions about this title were aroused when publishers Mindscape didn't send them a review copy, and said suspicions were vindicated when they eventually picked it up from a local shop's bargain bin, saying that all copies of the game should be thrown into a larger version of said bin and left to rot. I can't disagree with any of this. This port of an already 3-year-old NES game is an absolute shocker. I'm not even a big fan of Battletoads, but it deserved better. It's a controlling nightmare. You tap the single button to attack and hold it to jump, which goes as well as you'd expect, and even the first level's enemies are too much for Rash, Pimple and Zitz when faced with this sort of horror, let alone any jump. As hard as this title famously ends up getting over the course of playing it, I fear to imagine how this port deals with the likes of the Turbo Tunnel or the Rat Race. Good lord. As it is, I'm quite happy to just not get past the first level on this disaster and leave it at that. Right, I'm going to do 2 games in one here. They're both very similar and they're both jazz games. We've got Cover Girl Poker and Deluxe Strip Poker too. The first one got 6% and the second one got 7%. Deluxe Strip Poker 2 is a very dull and virtually silent bout of cards, while Cover Girl Poker is actually a bit more interesting, so we'll have a closer look at that one. Mark Ramshaw failed to see much point in the whole thing. He said that you could buy about 15 Scud Mags or at least 5 months worth of the Daily Sport for the £26 that this game cost. Speaking of the Daily Sport, they're actually involved in this. Yes, The Sport, a true bastion of British journalism, kins of great British scoops such as Mars Bars Up Arse Champ branded cheat for using the small multi-pack ones, banned from Chinese buffet for shitting in the seaweed, and Sex with Mr. Frosty mangled my bellend. Oh, and lots of pics of ladies, some of which you might recognise in this game here, like Maria Whittaker of Barbarian cover fame. All this is much more interesting than the game, which is, well, it's bog standard 5-card draw poker. You get very repetitive comments from whichever woman you choose to play against, and your reward for taking their money is a series of very grainy screen captures that you can zoom in on, just so you can really get an eyeful of those artifacts. It's utter crap, although the music isn't too bad in that lounge jazz type of way. I sure wouldn't mind playing a game that was based on the daily sports headlines, mind you. That'd certainly be better than this. We move along from rhythm gaming to something that'll take us to the skies. Or not, as the case may be. Flight Path 737 is a really old flight sim from Namco, 1987 to be precise, and it got a reissue from Prism in July 1991. Stuart Campbell gave it 6%, said that the game was so bad it was on a whole other plane of reality, and that if he ever had to play it again it would be 4 billion lifetimes too soon. So what we have here is a flight sim with no 3D graphics whatsoever. Forget about anything that Microprose or whatever were doing, 2D is obviously the way to go for a game like this if you're Anko, but I guess that's the game showing its age. A lot of people cite this as one of the Amiga's very worst titles, and, well, it certainly is a pain. It's not just the lack of speed or the near total lack of variation, seeing as every flight seems to consist of the same thing except a bit longer, it's, well, the uncompromising physical ugliness. After fighting the seconds per frame action and slow controls to even, just for a few seconds, get in the air, I was greeted by a view of what was supposed to be mountains, but instead just looked like a drunken man had puked up their kebab over the windshield of my aircraft. And then, naturally, I crashed again. It probably should be recognised just how early this game is. Even in 1987 this was an update of an 8-bit game from 1984. But in 1991? Well, there's not much point at all or pleasure to be found in re-releasing this one. Not even for a couple of quid. Prism's back for even more budget fun. Highway Patrol 2 is an old game by Microids that got 6% on its re-release in 1992. Rich Pelly said that the only slight saving grace was that this driving game doesn't set a route for you, and if it had then it may well have received a minus mark. Anyway, what we have here is essentially a 16-bit version of the original Highway Patrol, which first appeared on the Amstrad CPC, and I hope to God it's better there. The barren desert you move across is one thing, but the real killer is the driving controls themselves. You move like you're on ice whether you're on the road or on the sand. The slightest turn is liable to send you out of control and careering into signs or nearby cacti, and if another car's coming at you, geez, it's nigh on impossible to avoid them. I never even got the chance to catch my first gangster, I couldn't even get close to them. So yes, this is rather awful indeed. While it may be an open-ended driving game of sorts, I sure as hell don't want to hear anything in the comments about this being some proto-Grand Theft Auto or Driver or whatever, because this pile of crap influenced nothing and deserves nothing. You should only touch this one if you think it's the only way to live out your long-sought-after dreams of cosplaying as Frank Ponch from Chips. And yeah, I know it's not a motorcycle. Here's another Prism budget release. However, this one is far worse than Eye of Horus, or indeed any other we've seen. This is Protector, a game by Paradox, no, not the same folks behind Crusader Kings, all the way from 1986, re-released in the summer of 1991. Stuart Campbell gave this 6% and proclaims that this is the worst Defender clone it's been his misfortune to come across, and I have to agree with that. I had a right pain even trying to find this one actually. There is a different and certainly better game called Protector by Virgin Mastertronic, but this is a whole other kettle of fish. In the end I had to play the Atari ST version, as I simply couldn't find any discs for the Amiga. As it goes, this ST version is the original, so I can't imagine it's any different on the old MIGI. Good lord, this is an absolute maulin of an arcade classic. The turning of your ship involves your craft very slowly making its way to the other side of the screen, which is hilariously incompetent. You get unavoidable homing missiles if you're not careful, a ridiculously slow fire rate, and some of the worst music to ever come out of a sound chip. This just gets nothing whatsoever right, and I'd actually be tempted to go even lower than the 6% that Amiga Power gave out. Total disaster. Even paying £3 for this would have been a major rip-off, although judging by this being so hard to find any record whatsoever of, clearly nobody did, so that's a relief. How's about another game that's a bit more risque? Mrs. How's your father and all of that? Well, I've got another one of those here. Geisha, a 1991 adventure game from French game makers Cocktail Vision. You know, it's a bit raunchy because they actually sold this one in a brown paper bag type box. Gary Penn did not like this. He gave it 5%. Yep, a new low for the video, and said that it was as user-friendly and as sexy as a rotten anchovy. The plot is, well, it's as ridiculous as you'd expect. You need to save your twin sister from some mad scientist who's using her to try and create some perfect sex bot, and in doing so will literally pleasure her to death. Have you ever seen the Gush sketch from Jam? It's a bit like that. Obviously there's a lot of this title that I can't show, but perhaps most amusing, and rubbish, are the adverts and minigames you can play via a service called SexyTel, including a crap top-down shoot-'em-up called Penetration, and some ridiculous lady diving game. Other than that, well, it is indeed hopeless on the design front. The menu system is a complete disaster, and I managed to get to a point where I couldn't even figure out how to leave a bloody scene or do anything except repeat the conversation I'd just had. Sadly, it appears as though the designers of this game were too busy consuming their own product, so to speak, to be able to actually make something that wasn't fundamentally broken. The shocking interface alone is enough to justify the score of 5% without contemplating the cringy content and pitiful dialogue that even Mills and Boon would have chucked directly into a skip. You may be surprised at just how many Hanna-Barbera licensed games ended up on the Micros and the Amiga. It's a freaking lot. Most of them were released by High-Tech, and the quality was wildly variable. For example, the best of them all, Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, Amiga Power gave that 90%, and quite rightly because it's a belter of a platformer that almost justifies old Scrappy's existence on its own. Almost. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have Huckleberry Hound in Hollywood Capers, published by Alternative. This got 5% in 1993, with reviewer Stuart Campbell saying that this looks like it was knocked up in 20 minutes by a 6-year-old boy using totally useless platform game construction kit. A budget title this may be, but it is a bit sad. Our friendly hound probably warranted more than the 3 or so frames of animation he's got, and he doesn't even get any extra ones for jumping. He just, well, flips. Exactly like Sonic, except not at all. It's very generic, slapshod Euro platform stuff really. Collect all the gems in vertical levels, watch out for the various tiles that have different effects, and that's it. It's very bad. I wouldn't go as far as 5%, but it's certainly in the 10 to 20 range. We've got another all-timer right here. AP didn't get the chance to review Outrun on its original arrival, but a 1994 budget re-release of the title from Kix finally let them unleash their poison pen on one of the computer's very worst arcade ports, with Jonathan Nash scoring it 5% and calling it a fully and unrepentantly poor thing dating from the dawn of time as we know it, and eventually getting bored with cataloguing its plenitude of disasters. Even though this re-release now priced the title at a crispy $5, it still feels like a whopping great rip-off. This was a misery even back in 1987, a mouse-driven racer where the choppy graphics and movement of the other cars make it just about unplayable. Even the game's early release can't justify its shortcomings, considering that other much better ports, such as Super Hang-On, also mentioned in this review as an alternative, were knocking it out of the park at virtually the same time. Quite clearly awful, and only ever worth loading up for its ludicrous and completely ill-fitting overdramatic introduction. There may be some quite obscure games in this vid, but naturally there's also some big hitters from the world of bad Amiga titles, and few come bigger than Rise of the Robots. While other mags such as CU Amiga and Amiga Action gave the title scores in the 80s and 90s, Amiga Power gave it an absolutely savage 5%, with Jonathan Davies fearing for the immortal souls of the magazines quoted on the packaging that said you'd wish all games were this good, going through all the game's critical failures in intimate detail, scorning every last bit of hype and calling it all an astonishing waste of time. It's one of the greatest pieces of copy in the magazine's history, and every last word of it is pinpoint accurate. A 13-disc nightmare, one disc for every month of hype proclaiming that this was going to be the future of gaming, where the niceties of the graphics can't disguise the utterly tragic turkey lying within. I don't need to expand much more on this one than I've already done over the years, really. It remains one of the great British gaming swindles. As mentioned before, a video like this brings up the most obscure of titles, and here we have a budget football management game called Treble Champions 2 by the much maligned Challenge Software. This £10 budget title was reviewed as late as April of 1996 in AP60 by Martin Axford, who says that it's of such poor quality and execution that he wouldn't even give it to an orphan. There is not an awful lot to say about this, but it sure would have been a waste of a tenner. It is a very basic footy manny game with no graphics whatsoever to speak of. Just enter a team name and a manager name and there you go. You get a load of random players and it's all text. It's as exciting as it looks, this. I mean, at least the Graham Souness game had some frickin' Football Manager-esque highlights. Football management was a very dense market on the Amiga, and this... well, this is at the very bottom of the Amiga football pyramid. I wouldn't even trade you a rancid burger and a cup of cold Bovril for this game. So, did you think that the last game was too exciting? Well, you best look away, because here's another football management game by Challenge Software to look at. This is World of Soccer from 1994, and it was also given 5% by AP. Steve McGill says that games like this are the enemy of the Amiga market, virtually guaranteed to sell a few units simply by having the word soccer in the title, and potentially drowning out better games as a result. I can't say I know whether anyone actually bought this or not, but essentially this is the same very basic deal as Treble Champions 2. Something I find amusing is that this actually has a bit more in the way of graphics than the later game, which is a bit perverse, although hilariously not in places where that would matter. There's no icons for the different screens you can go to, and instead you get squares on the bottom filled by a single capital letter. That's obviously very clear and very easy indeed to smoothly navigate. I mean, words are overrated. In any case, someone at Challenge clearly thought at some point that the pictures of a pitch or a filing cabinet were way too flashy and distracted from the real core gameplay of this football management game. So, yeah, this is pretty clearly miserable stuff. And also, it was sold at £20, double the price of their later game. Amusingly enough, Martin Axford reviewed a re-release of this game in August 1996, and it actually got a better score. Well, 11% that time out, but technically better at least. Think that you're finished yet? We're not finished yet. Here's Doofus, a game by Prestige Software that got all of 4% in the mag's January 1994 issue. The review is certainly better than the game, a high concept affair in which a man goes to the afterlife and is damned to play the game for all eternity. Jonathan Nash proclaims it the worst platformer that he has ever seen, and believes it's genuinely depressing that somebody spent months creating it and believed it was worth selling for £28. But what of now, when we've all lived in the presence of Doofus for 30 years? Well, the great thing about offensively European platformers is that just when you think you've seen the platonic ideal of one on the Amiga, something else comes along that's even more stereotypical. And holy shit, look at this utterly garish mess. Doofus is indeed complete nonsense, and it plays quite terribly too. The most annoying part of the game is the dog that's with you. You have to keep him alive, and he jumps a good second or so after you. So, good luck with a barrel or something else you can't just shoot down. It may well be a different concept, but it's kind of inherently flawed, seeing as quite literally, by design, it makes the jumping hugely unresponsive. When you combine this with everything else about Doofus, basically a greatest hits of dreadful Euro platforming, I can definitely see why it got one of AP's lowest ever scores. But apparently, there's one other platformer that's even worse. I love finding another terrible old football game that no one's ever heard of. This one is called European Champions. No, not the game of the same name by Ocean, that's actually quite decent. This is a whole other animal, released by Idea in the summer of 1992 to coincide with the year's big tournament. Its score of 4% was the lowest the mag had given at the time, with Stuart Campbell saying that anyone who buys the game would be the victim of the most criminal theft of anybody's money since Robert Maxwell went to sleep with the fishies. What we've got here is an absolutely miserable, pale imitation of the likes of Sensible Soccer and Kickoff. You may look at the game's speed and think it doesn't necessarily look as bad as some, but oh boy. The movement is awful. It actually feels like you're on a grid, which is not exactly conducive to fluid football action. Still, once you figure that out, you're met with a stonkingly easy game. You can very easily score simply by running straight forward with the ball, ideally after a goal kick, and shooting straight at the goalie on the edge of the area. Either it goes in, or the ball rebounds directly to you, and then you can just walk it in. Sam Allardyce would be so proud. Oh, and there's not a lot of threat from the CPU. Some of the attempts they tried to make at scoring were just pure comedy, and most of the time they just end up kicking the ball out for a goal kick. 26 bloody quid this game cost, by the way. And honestly, Vector Soccer might just have a new challenger. Shocking failure that might be. At least it was trying something different. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the new worst football game on the Amiga. For now. I'm going to do two games in one for this next entry, as they are both virtually identical. We have Test Match Cricket and International One Day Cricket by Challenge Software. These are the same guys who gave us Treble Champions 2. Test Match was given 4% by Martin Axford, while One Day got 3% from Gideon Kibblewhite, and the drive of each review is the same. This is brain-numbing tedium that makes cricket seem even more boring than it already is. So this is a very niche sort of game. This is cricket management, much like the World Cricket game we saw earlier, but considerably deeper in terms of options. You play as the captain and make various decisions, such as how aggressive you want the batters to be, the fielding positions, the behaviour of the bowlers. And yes, it's all text-based and, to say the least, not very exciting. This is not my cup of tea at all, but I do think it's at least a tiny bit better than the footy game these guys did on account of having a lot more tactical options for the game. Still, you really need to be a very big cricket head for this, the sort that holds wisdom in the same regard as Christians hold the Bible. However, as much as it may all be fancy spreadsheets, I have a bit more respect for this, seeing as there's not a lot of cricket strategy games out there compared to football management ones. Unlike a lot of titles here, I am sure there were a few people out there who were desperate enough to actively lap this game up. Usually the more appealing looking likes of the International Cricket Captain games, a series that started in 1998 and is still going today, feel the desires of people who enjoy this rather niche little subgenre. Right, we've come to where the big boys play. The 3% titles. Even compared to what we've seen already, these ones may well be quite a shock. We start with an American football game, 4th and Inches. This was a re-release of an Accolade game from 1988, and Tim Tucker subjected it to a beating in June of '93. Not only was this a nightmare to even get working on any Amiga that he tried it on, when it was working the action itself was comparable to a geriatric Morris dance being enacted before your unbelieving eyes. A perfectly good version of John Madden Football was available on the Amiga by this point, and that in itself goes a long way to making this feel absolutely ancient. The game is so choppy and the animation so non-existent that I honestly couldn't make head nor tail of what was going on here, and I had absolutely no idea who I was even playing as. I'm like a panicked Bobby Heenan, yelling, "Whose side is he on?" at the screen. Now, I am sure that back in its heyday, and most probably on the C64 as opposed to here, 4th and Inches was a game that deserved respect compared to other gridiron offerings on the market. Back then it was one of the sharpest on the field. With that in mind, re-releasing it in the middle of 1993, when things had moved on so much further, feels like an exercise in abject humiliation and character assassination. Big game fishing. Big game fishing? Oh yes, big game fishing. That's literally the whole 3-word review of this game, by the way. Jonathan Nash encountered it as part of another bloody Prism Hits for 6 compilation in September of 1994, and, well, clearly he didn't have much to say about it, but he did give it 3%. This is another game that I couldn't find a lot of info about. It was originally released in 1991 by Italian software house Simul Mondo, and the only version of the game that I could find was, indeed, Italian. Not that it's a particularly deep game, of course. It's a game where you get out on the seas in search of the biggest bass or eel or tench or whatever. If it's big and it's slippery, you're on to a winner. If you can figure out head nor tail about this game, which I couldn't, and you likely won't be able to either. This doesn't have much to do with the language barrier, really. It's more to do with an interface that favours trying and failing to be graphically nice instead of being in any way whatsoever functional. Like, how do you actually do any fishing? Have I even cast the line out? Is there any bait on it? Am I just standing on this boat doing nothing with my tackle aimlessly flailing about in the wind? The answers sure as hell don't come easy. There aren't a lot of fishing games on the Amiga, but I can say with confidence that this is surely the very worst of them. If you bought this, then you basically didn't do much more except splash a couple of quid out on a crappy screensaver of the sea. Few things sum up the sheer hopelessness of Commodore's final days better than their decision to launch the CD32 with, of all games, Dangerous Streets as its lead pack-in title. They even called said bundle the Dangerous Streets Pack. There's not much mystery here. Flare Software's game is a serious contender for being the worst fighting game ever made, a great deal worse than Rise of the Robots, and launching a new console with this is akin to replacing the bottle of champagne you're supposed to break on a ship's bow with a lit stick of dynamite. No Amiga magazine gave this game a good review, but if Amiga Power ever wanted to truly eviscerate a game with frenzied but exquisitely written bile, they naturally often turned to the Scottish bloke with the spiky haircut. Stuart Campbell said that if you were to load up this game on your brand new machine in front of your mates, they'd quickly make their excuses and leave, never speak to you again, tell everyone they know about it, which will result in you losing your job and your home, being shunned by society, becoming a sad, lonely alcoholic, and eventually dying of shame in a cold gutter. Of course, this is a game that gets nothing whatsoever right. Not only is the action itself so simplistic that you can just win any fight through randomly bashing buttons because the computer's AI is thoroughly useless, it also features the absolute worst characters ever seen in a fighting game. Every single design is just this monumentally stupid, profound embarrassment that would probably have been rejected by the makers of Eurotrash on the grounds of being too immature. As overused a phrase as this may be in the world of retro gaming YouTube videos, what the fuck were they thinking? Still, Flair's game being so dreadful is one thing. The decision to actively promote this as the CD32's lead title is even more amusing. What kind of marketing genius was responsible for that move, I wonder? So this is the worst platformer, according to Amiga Power. Ed the Duck 2, Back with a Quack, a 1993 game from budget publisher Zeppelin. Jeez, this one takes me back. The review says that it makes the language we're allowed to use for a family magazine seem inadequate, with Stuart Campbell only giving it 3% because of the nice intro screen. After being ripped from the relative safety of Andy Peters' shoulder, Ed the Duck finds himself in a rather nonsensical Wild West themed platformer in which items absolutely must be collected at all costs. Naturally there's birds, people in big hats and other assorted things that wish to stop you for some reason, but you can stop them with a well-aimed custard pie. It is at least a bit more original than the first Ed the Duck game, which was a straight-up budget knockoff of Rainbow Islands. But yes, it most certainly does suck. Definitely worth a sub 10% score, especially with the daft license to really ram it home. But is this actually worse than Doofus? It's a pretty close one, to be honest. They are both very awful indeed. But I am more inclined to give Doofus the nod over the Duck. I can't get over that stupid dog mechanic, and I do have to consider that whilst Ed the Duck 2 was a budget game, Doofus was actually on shop shelves for nearly 30 bloody quid. A tough choice indeed. I mean, there's barely a lethal drop of water between them, but Doofus is the winner. Oh dear, not bloody Last Action Hero. Surely the worst game to ever come out with Psygnosis' name on it. This one was completely ripped apart in every magazine. Even Amiga Action couldn't give it any more than 28%. But Amiga Power naturally led the way once again in July of 1994 with a 3% score from Stuart Campbell. It's a game where you stand still and hold down the fire button to deal with absolutely everything that comes your way, and it's at least as bad as Dangerous Streets. Damning indeed. Of the many rather awful games based on this particular Arnie film, Last Action Hero is undoubtedly the worst. A horrible belt-scroller beat-em-up where most characters have no resemblance to anything from the movie. The only really amusing part is the animations. You can just hold down the button to repeat moves over and over, which means you do get utterly stupid things like Arnie's endless headbutt, which just looks like he's headbanging to the game's music, which could have been okay but ends up being aggressively grating due to the sounds it's opted for. Off the top of my head, I can't think of too many belt scrollers that are worse than this one. It's such a simplistic and basic game that it won't even let you walk to the next lot of enemies, which, as the review says, you just deal with by doing the same thing over and over. Psygnosis were also responsible for Cliffhanger, the second worst game to come out with their name on it, and one that could have easily made this list. As it is, Amiga Power gave that one 19%. Hell, I've heard rumours that these games were purposefully bad. That Sony ImageSoft, who were also involved, deliberately put some dreadful games on the market to try and convince people that the 16-bit era was dead and that you should start thinking about upcoming 32-bit machines such as, I don't know, the Sony PlayStation. Shoutouts to Craig Charlesworth for that one. Anywho, whether that's true or not, this is still a definite all-time turkey. 3% is right on the money. The last of the 3% games takes us to the track. It's Touring Car Challenge from OTM Publications. This was reviewed in September 1995 and Steve Farragher was, needless to say, pretty damn critical. He couldn't imagine this appealing to touring car fans and thought it would be more enjoyable to construct a basic program along the lines of 10, Derek Warwick is racing, whee 20 go to 10. That and he uncovered a darker secret about the game that we will get into. As it stands, Touring Car Challenge is a rather threadbare bit of racing management. You don't actually do any racing yourself. You pick 2 drivers, spend a bit of cash on their engine and their skill, pick a setup for their cars based on weather conditions, and not much else. You just watch the race happen, events unfold in text, and you may possibly have to go to the pits, although it's often not necessary in a touring car race. It's too short. There's not a lot to it. It is pretty damn bad, although we have definitely seen worse games. However, I did mention a dark secret. Well, what's that? As the review says, this game is exactly the same as a title named F1 Challenge. It's just that game only with touring cars, and the pit stops make a bit more sense in the first game because the races are longer. And what's the really shit-ass thing about this, you wonder? Well, F1 Challenge was a public domain game that you could buy mail order for £5. This is a full price game that was on the shelves for 26 quid, and again, it is identical. I think that, more than anything else, is what warrants the score of 3%, because that's a frankly diabolical move. But unfortunately a rather typical one for these rather miserable later years of the Amiga, I'm afraid. Right, it's the second to last game. We've had quite a few 3% games, but in June 1993, International Rugby Challenge was the first to go one step further. Stuart Campbell gave it 2%. An absolutely vicious 3-page screed isn't even enough to sum up all the problems with it. Apparently the whole magazine would have been required for that. In fact, having electrodes attached to your nether regions and being flogged with a knotted rope is, according to Stuart, a better experience. I wouldn't know personally, and it ends with him calling it the worst game that he has ever seen. Now, I'd never actually played this one before this video, but having played it, well, it's shocking and baffling. Thing is, Domark's game was a sequel to a much better title, 1991's Rugby the World Cup. That one actually got 86% from Amiga Power. The version of this game on Mega Drive, International Rugby, that's excellent. It's got a similar vibe to Sensible Soccer, only in rugger form. So what the hell happened here? It's hard to pick the most hilarious thing. It is inexplicably so much choppier than the original. The AI is so non-existent that you're almost guaranteed a try whenever you pick up the ball because they won't tackle you. The game defaults to giving you mouse controls and a real-time 40-minute per half match, so God help you if you don't look at the options. And the clock still runs down if the game's paused. Especially considering that I've had so many good times with the Mega Drive version of this title, I am honestly amazed by this one, and I am rather curious as to just what went so utterly wrong with it. Incredible. Well, here we are. The very top of the mountain, the worst score ever delivered by Amiga Power. Kickoff 96. Stuart Campbell's review comes in the magazine's 65th and final issue from September 1996, a 4-page marathon where the reviewer is put on trial by the 4 cyclists of the apocalypse for the crime of killing the Amiga by scorching software publishers for putting out bad games. I'll just put the final uppers section in here verbatim so you can get a feel for it. Take it away, Matthew Smith.
It's a shabby rip-off aimed at separating desperate and gullible Amiga owners from their money. It's riddled with bugs, it's clearly been rushed out with the absolute minimum of effort, and the fact that there are still people out there stupid enough to buy it because of the name or because they think, well, it's Amiga Power, they would say that, who'll then have 20 quid less to spend on food, rent and heating, possibly leading to their death from starvation or hypothermia, and a subsequent microscopic increase in the world's average IQ, is the only reason it's getting any marks at all.
And it did get a mark. 1%, the lowest in the history of the magazine. Now, a big subtext to the whole review was that Amiga Power had always been accused of major bias against the Kick-Off series, one of the most popular on the platform, especially when compared to Sensible Soccer, although honestly the glory days of the series were well behind it by the time the mag actually debuted in 1991. Kick-Off 96 is indeed a very damp squib from a publisher in Anko who'd barely done a jot good since those days. Even for people who like the Kick-Off games, and admittedly I'm not one of them, this must have felt like a pale imitator of what had come before. It honestly runs far worse than the frickin' original game from 1989, and it does indeed have a lot of bugs. But is it the worst game that the magazine ever reviewed? Nah, I wouldn't say so. International Rugby Challenge is a lot worse, for a start. In fact, I wouldn't say it's the worst football game the mag reviewed. European Champions is even more incompetent than this title. It is definitely down there, but I feel that if this had been reviewed somewhere other than the final issue of the magazine, it'd have probably got around 6 to 8% or so. It would still be here, of course, because it is total dog shit, but not the worst. But it was certainly a memorable review for Amiga Power to finish on, even if it was also an utterly savage one. So, there we are. That's all the games. How about some stats? As far as reviewers go, there's no prizes whatsoever available for guessing who was responsible for most of these low scores. Stuart Campbell reviewed 15 out of the 38 games here, which is a bit surprising to me as when I was counting them up I honestly thought he'd have gone over the halfway mark. Jonathan Nash is second with 9, largely thanks to all those Prism compilation reviews, while Rich Pelly and Martin Axford are tied for third with 2 games apiece. Of all these reviews, yeah, they were spot on most of the time, although I would say there's a couple of games that deserved better, particularly Blade Warrior and Eye of Horus. Ruffian honestly isn't as bad as the 10% mark would suggest, and I do wonder if there were any strong messages received at AP Towers for Campbell's take on Secret of the Silver Blades that couldn't possibly have been printed in Do the Right Thing. Overall, it's been quite fun to examine just what Amiga Power thought were the worst games ever released on the Amiga, largely because it's put the spotlight on a few obscure titles that aren't particularly infamous, but are most certainly dreadful. Sure, there's also room for some of the best known Amiga disasters. We've got the Rise of the Robots, the Dangerous Streets, the Last Action Heroes and so on. But don't you think that your life's been significantly improved now that you know so much more about Doofus, European Champions, and big game fishing? What do you mean, no? Still, either way, hopefully you've enjoyed this little video, and until the next time, bye for now.